What's up, fam? Smash the like button for the algorithm and let's get started with the story. A single 5-star hotel loomed above the city, while the other was more like a collection of modest dwellings. The remaining hotels were all of a lower quality. It was a sunny day at the Jauria Hotel, which happened to be the 100th best hotel in the nation. In the large kitchen, the chefs were hard at work. The protagonist appeared anxious as he worked diligently. On the platters, you could see carrots and onions cut into thin slices. Someone yelled out to Sunghoon as he wiped the perspiration off his brow, sighing heavily. While using a rag to wipe his hands, he glanced back. He was asked by the man to attend the forthcoming culinary session in his stead and indicate his absence. The cook questioned why the seniors were required to attend these seminars instead of the juniors when he raised an objection. In an embarrassed nod, the young man consented. Looking down, the young man couldn't believe he was being treated like a junior, even though he had joined the hotel 4 years ago. A chef inquired as to whether or not the garbage can had been removed. The trainee was told to clean the camp when he said he hadn't done it yet while holding a bowl of food. The main character dipped his head and lifted the bucket. Every hotel had a tank on the floor for storing oil. Formerly, it was called a grease trap, but in the kitchen, it was just a garbage can. Sunghoon raised the hefty steel tank. Upon hearing that his coworker had set fire to everything, he glanced up. The chef yelled out to his apprentice, "Stop making such rudimentary mistakes!" while waving his hand. The young lad lowered himself and expressed regret. Jinik oversaw a crew of 17 cooks and was currently frowning in disapproval. As far as the youngster could tell, the captain was perpetually irritated whenever he witnessed his subordinates in the kitchen, yet he never failed to deliver the correct response. An icy expression crossed the man's face. Upon noticing him, the child immediately averted his gaze. Following the disposal of the garbage can, the intern resolved that he would undoubtedly be acknowledged at some point. When someone inquired as to why they had brought it there, he glanced up in perplexion. The irate cleaner put her hands on her hips and claimed she had recently discarded it. The main character expressed his apologies and clarified that his superior had requested him to carry it out. Looking down, the woman inquired about the duration of his treatment as a junior, and whether new cooks were indeed necessary. Sunghoon responded after a moment of thought that the seniors would need to step down before he, as an assistant, could even consider the possibility. The man boasted that his dishwashing skills had improved over the past 3 years. The cleaner expressed the need to advance in his work more rapidly, wearing a sorrowful expression. In response to being requested to vacate the garbage can, the young man put up his hand and inquired about the well-being of everyone involved. He was told to return to his work by the woman, who said she would be returning later. Beside the cabinet stood a water cooler. The intern straightened his tie and reached for his phone, determined to obtain the seminar's schedule. The protagonist's jaw dropped open in disbelief as he realized he was running behind schedule. The sun was blazing over the massive edifice as Sunghoon hurried onward. As he stepped into a hallway, the man made an effort to collect himself. Every seat in the room was filled, including the one directly in front of him. The youth beheld the table and understood that he must first register. Approached from behind, a stranger recognized him and greeted him by name. It was Shanti, an old acquaintance of his, it turned out. It had been quite some time since they had last met, he indicated by waving his hand. Once upon a time, this man had a big check for taking first place in a large catering contest for soldiers. Because they were housed together for 8 weeks, the boys became buddies. They were sitting on the floor one day when the subject of mass catering came up. With clenched jaw, the trainee recalled how the Transport Support Battalion commander had repeatedly thwarted his attempts at creative mass cooking, insisting instead on simple, inexpensive fare. Garnishing these recollections within, the protagonist grinned. As they shook hands, he remembered that his former co-worker had also gone into the culinary arts. He was informed by the man that he was employed at the Hilton Hotel. Sunghoon congratulated him, and arched an eyebrow in surprise upon hearing this. Asked his friend's employer, Gianti said it was ordinary. The man responded that he was employed by a modest motel named Jauria after scrunching his cheek in humiliation. Curious as to whether it was a hotel in another country, the man said with an open jaw. In addition to running a medium-sized convenience store, the young man mentioned that their CEO was Korean. Since he would be learning nothing, the chef advised that he go. The apprentice looked down and clarified that his probationary period was still ongoing. When his friend handed him a business card and stated he needed to get in touch with him, he glanced up. Since Yunti knew people who could be of assistance, he proposed that they give each other a call at some point. With his eyes closed, our hero accepted the business card. His friend was thanked by Sunghoon. The man proposed attending the seminar after surveying their surroundings. According to the man, there are no more available seats. In one of the rows, there were 2 empty seats. They could just sit there, the chef remarked, as his top chefs weren't available today. The young man scratched the back of his head and laughed when his friend asked if he really wanted to just register and go home. People gathered in a large auditorium. Someone started checking the microphone. The speaker opened his mouth wide and said that they would like to inform everyone who would be attending the seminar. The intern looked around. The man at the podium said that the seminar would start in 5 minutes and asked everyone to gather by then, pointing to the side. The protagonist said that he needed to go to the restroom. Janti promised to see him again. Sunghoon was washing his hands in the sink when someone's silhouette appeared in the reflection of the mirror. The guy looked up. He flinched when the man behind him said that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The water from the tap was washing his hands, and the stranger was standing next to him, looking in the mirror. The young man noticed his reflection looking at him. The man called him by name. There was a malicious grin on his face. 8 years ago, there was a pagoda in front of the Yongdong Hotel. The intern was chopping onions on a cutting board. Crossing his arms over his chest, the cook asked if this was the one Gabby brought. The answer was affirmative. Illa grinned and offered to train him. His colleague asked if it was worth it since he would have to leave for work soon. The man raised his hand and said that was exactly why they needed to train him. His colleague said that it would be bad if he was caught. The cook told him not to worry and promised to prepare everything before leaving. The protagonist smiled. Night had fallen. The stars were shining above the hotel. There was a mountain of onions on the table. Sunghoon smiled widely and asked what he needed to do. Illa frowned in displeasure and ordered him to chow. As he made his way towards the exit, the man asked if he should repeat the task. Just as the young man was about to speak, the sound of a door closing silenced him. The sun shone brightly above the hotel, casting its warm rays on the trainee. The cook pointed to the pile of onions and asked what the trainee needed to do before breakfast. Ilu asked why all the vegetables hadn't been chopped yet. The protagonist, clutching his stomach, said that he shouldn't have to do it alone because such tasks require at least 4 people. Grabbing the man by the collar, the man asked if someone was supposed to assist him. The cook, kicking his subordinate, said that he could have stayed and done everything overnight. His colleague crossed his arms over his chest, asked the boy if he really thought he knew everything, and ordered him to do everything right. Sunghoon asked what they didn't like, and that's when things got rough. The boy covered his face with his hands, and Illa swung his leg, and that's when things got tough. For every little mistake, he would be hit on the head with a shovel. Behind him, there was a pile of onions that needed chopping. Gradually, the punishments became more and more irrational. After 3 months of bullying, the young man pursed his lips and realized that he was gradually losing his enthusiasm. The intern slashed the board with a knife and decided to leave the Mongdong Hotel, vowing to forget about becoming a chef. Taking off his uniform and setting it on as they stood in the restroom, the 2 heroes exchanged glances. The man with the glasses asked Sunghoon why his eyes were so red and angry, and if his former colleague was still acting like a chef. Jianji asked Sunghoon to stop, and Ilu turned around to see a smile on his face. As they headed out, the chef sincerely apologized, placing his hands on his friend's shoulders. The man with the glasses asked if everything was alright, since the seminar was almost over and he still hadn't shown up. Closing his eyes, the young man answered that everything was fine. The man stood at the lectern, while the heroes sat in the hall and listened. After thanking them for their time, the speaker moved on to the main topic, which involved the Mitchell and guide appearing on the screen behind him. The man then announced that the guide had started to be published in Korea and expressed regret that this had happened. The intern raised an eyebrow. The speaker then asked why their country should be influenced by a foreign culinary magazine instead of their own. In connection with this event, the speaker raised his hand and announced that they would begin to rate Korean hotels based on the Korean cuisine they offered. The protagonist opened his mouth in shock, while the audience failed to comprehend what he was saying because they were expecting a new rule to appear, and that was it. Leaning over, Jonggi decided that they were not joking. Sunghoon agreed and suggested that all the head chefs would start going crazy. Looking to the side, the guy remembered that the tourism promotion agency had already rated their hotel and realized that now even the kitchen would be rated. Looking around the room, the speaker expressed confidence that some would question the fairness of this rating system, so they would broadcast the entire process on the KVS channel. Pointing at the screen, the speaker said that the results would also be shown on KVS. Frowning, the young man thought that the rating of the hotel kitchens would be shown on television. Gritting his teeth, he realized that, in other words, this was an announcement of a cooking competition. People left the audience holding a booklet in his hands. Jonggi explained that only the top 20 would be ranked and that it would likely only include people the judges knew, because participating chefs had to have less than 10 years of experience. Closing the booklet, the man said it was hard. The intern said his friend had been in the position for 8 years, but he had more experience, so he could participate. Raising his eyebrows, the chef asked if his friend was going to participate. Putting his hand to his chin, the protagonist replied that he needed to think about it. Raising his hand, Sunghoon realized that he couldn't participate because no one in their right mind would allow an ordinary assistant to participate. Closing his eyes, Jianji became upset and said that he would like to cook in the same kitchen with him again. Waving his hand, the man said that he needed to report everything to the head chef. The guy said goodbye, and the guy watched his friend with a smile. Suddenly, he shouted. The phone lying on the table vibrated. The young man put the phone to his ear and heard beeps. The intern raised his eyebrows in disappointment, assuming that his colleague was busy. The voice on the other end of the line asked why they were calling him only now, and frowning, the protagonist explained that the seminar had just ended. The chef, standing in the kitchen, shouted that they had a huge number of tourists from China, so they were short of some ingredients. Sunghoon raised his hand and asked why they didn't order delivery, and the man on the line said that the ingredients were his responsibility. The guy closed his eyes and sighed and said that he would be there soon. The man asked what he had told the juniors, and looking back, the chef replied that he had asked him to buy the ingredients and that the assistant would be back soon. Jinya crossed his arms over his chest, assuming that his subordinate had already learned about the KV's program. A smile appeared on his face. The hotel staff were working in the kitchen, frowning in displeasure. The chef ordered them to work faster while chopping carrots. Jong Man thought that if the younger had returned from the seminar earlier, they wouldn't have been so busy. The blonde looked up tensely. The captain looked at him. When he was called, frowning, the boy asked why he had delegated the purchase of ingredients to the younger instead of doing it himself like before. Raising his eyebrows, the man asked if he still didn't know. The boy's mouth dropped open in confusion, and he replied in the negative. Jinak closed his eyes and sighed heavily, turning away. The chef stated that his subordinate was still a long way off. There was a sea bass lying on the cutting board. The captain scratched his chin as he looked at it. The employee looked at him and asked why he was looking at it so seriously. The man asked if he thought it was wild or farmed, and Jong Man walked over to the table and replied that it looked wild. The fish was over 50 centimeters long and maintained its color. It had a bright pink hue and blue diamonds in the lusk. Jinik closed his eyes and said that this was a very common method of judging, but experts classified it in a different way. The nostril of the fish was divided into 2 parts, and this should not be the case with wild fish. The chef bent down and took a closer look. The head chef said that his subordinate brought them all separately. The captain smiled broadly and said that they had a large catch. The setting sun was shining over GCK Market. The protagonist approached the counter. The seller looked back when she heard his voice. The woman stood up from her chair and asked what her friend was doing there at such a time. Sunghoon replied that he came to see her and asked if the goods for tomorrow had been delivered. On the floor were boxes of Cheongju apples and Sangju apples. The guy extended his hand towards them and asked them to wait a little. He took the apple in his hand. An image of rain falling in an apple orchard appeared in his mind. The young man handed the apple to the clerk and said that they were low on sugar. The woman asked what that meant, since they were Cheongju, the most delicious apples in Korea. Pointing at the fruit, the intern explained that if you touch the apple, you can feel that it had rained heavily. Picking up the apple, the protagonist offered the clerk a taste. Taking the fruit, the clerk was surprised, since she had been in this business for so many years. There was a peeled apple on the plate. The woman put 1 slice in her mouth. Her face grimaced at how sour the apple was. The clerk said that yesterday's apples were much better. Sunho smiled and suggested that yesterday's fruits were from a different batch. Putting his hand on the crate of apples, the young man said that it was better to return them because they were better for juice but not for restaurants. The saleswoman crossed her arms and decided that they needed to be returned as soon as possible and that she would have been in trouble without him, asking how he knew they were sour just by touching them. The young man replied that he knew one method and touched other apples, saying they were good. The intern asked. The woman was to send 3 boxes of these fruits to the hotel, and the saleswoman agreed. While picking up her phone and looking at the phone screen, the protagonist decided to check what else he needed to buy. There was a man standing behind the fish counter. Hearing his name called, Mansa looked around. The man asked what the customer was doing there at such a time, and Sunghoon scratched his head and asked if sales were going well. The saleswoman answered in the affirmative and asked what was wrong. There were crabs in the aquarium, and the young man noticed that the selection was poorer than usual today. Smiling, he said he would like to buy some blue crabs. The salesman called someone on the phone, hung up, and smiled, pointing to the side. Mansa said that there were blue crabs in the store nearby that were caught that morning. The crabs were sitting in the water. Looking at them, the young man asked if they were definitely caught today. The seller said that they were in the sea this morning. The intern put his hand to the crab. An image of an animal sitting on the bottom of the sea appeared in his mind. Suddenly, a net covered it. The fisherman took the net out of the water. There were many crabs in the container. The people went ashore, placing the boxes on the ground. The fisherman handed one of them to the merchant. The protagonist examined the crab, smiling contentedly. He realized that they were really fresh. Happily closing his eyes, the man said that they were not deceiving anyone. Sunghoon asked him for a business card. The seller handed over a map of the fish store, pointing to the side. The guy asked to deliver these crabs to the Joria Hotel. The sun set behind the horizon. The young man left the market. The phone vibrated in his pocket. The intern looked at it in surprise. He picked up the phone, seeing something. The protagonist frowned tensively. A message from Seoul Hospital Hit appeared on the screen, reminding him that his debt was 23 million. Sunghoon put the phone in his pocket. Inside, it was evening, and the lights were on in the Joria Hotel. The guy put on his uniform and entered the kitchen. Jongman was cooking something in a wok. Someone was boiling soup on the stove. Looking back, the lion cook called out to the junior employee, frowning in displeasure. The blonde asked him to hurry up and help him. At the request of his colleague, the young man hurried to bring him a plate of sausages. The next moment, he was already carrying a boiled duck. The man shouted that they were out of gas and needed to replace the cylinder, and the trainee ran to the warehouse, watching him being chased back and forth. Jongman smiled, giving him a slap on the back of the head. Henman asked why his hands had stopped, and asked him to hurry up. The lights went out in many of the hotel windows. The staff were cleaning the kitchen. Wiping his forehead, the protagonist thought that he finally had a chance to take a break. Looking at him, the man offered him to clean up dirty plates that fell into the sink filled with water. The guys were washing dishes. Jangman looked at them with displeasure, putting his hand to his head. The lion cook wondered when things had turned into this, and thought that he had always been in charge of cleaning and washing dishes when he was the youngest there. The man's lips turned down in disappointment. Watching Sunghoon wash the dishes, he wondered how it was possible that the seniors were helping him clean. The man with the plates in his hands asked why they were still wet. Frowning, Jongman said that he would do it right away. The clean dishes stood on the table and sparkled. The guy was putting the plates in the cupboard when someone asked him to come over for a second. The young man looked back. In front of him stood a very displeased lion cook. The man frowned sternly and asked why his colleague, who was simply asked to check in, sat through the seminar until the very end and returned to work so late when otherwise they would not be so overloaded with work. The intern looked down and apologized. Crossing his arms over his chest, Jongman said that the seniors should help him clean because his colleague could not do his job well. He said that in the past, he himself had to stay here until midnight at night and clean alone. The lion cook frowned and said that everyone should do their job and asked the employee to see what had happened because of him. Looking up, the protagonist interrupted him and asked him to speak more quietly. The man gritted his teeth and asked what it meant. He raised his hand to slap the junior, but someone grabbed his hand, stopping it. It turned out that it was Jean Yak. Jongman opened his mouth in shock. The chef furiously knitted his eyebrows and asked what was going on here and whether this was what he had taught him. The lion cook bowed and said no. The captain asked why his subordinate wanted to hit the junior. The blonde explained that the man was 4 years younger than him, and so he wanted to teach him not to be so sluggish at work. The man crossed his arms and remained silent. Hearing the words of apology, Jinnik flinched, closing his eyes. The protagonist said that the seniors wouldn't be so busy today and the cleaning would have been finished much earlier if he had worked a little faster. Bowing, Sunghoon said that it was his fault. The chef looked at him silently, smiling sheepishly. Jongman said that it was indeed true, sighing heavily. The captain said that he understood everything. Pointing a finger at his subordinate, the man shouted that raising a hand to his colleagues is unworthy behavior for a chef. The blonde said that he was sincerely sorry. Frowning, Jinnik suggested that they just clean up here and call it a day. The chef reminded him that there was a cooking test tomorrow and asked the junior to come straight to work instead of going to the store to buy things. The chefs bowed and agreed. There was a work uniform hanging in the closet, and the guy put on his usual clothes. He shuddered when he felt his phone vibrate. Taking it out, the young man looked at the screen. A message appeared. G wrote that they should meet at a cafe near the university and talk. Putting his phone in his pocket, the intern thought that this was all he needed. Putting his hand on his waist, John Man asked where his colleague was going. With his mouth wide open, the lion cook asked why the head chef cherished him so much, and why he needed to come to the test tomorrow. Smiling, the protagonist wanted to say that this was not the case, but the man interrupted him and asked what was the reason why the captain allowed him not to go to the store. Bowing, Sanan said that during the seminar, they said that the P was going to hold a program called Top Chef, and that they would be participating. He added that only those with less than 10 years of experience can participate, and that he would hardly be able to pass the test. John Man smiled widely and asked why Jinnik asked him to come to the test then. Putting his hands behind his back, the guy assumed that the head chef was going to ask him to take the colleague's job for a while. The boy said that he had urgent business and asked permission to leave. Slightly knitting his eyebrows, the line cook gave him his permission. The intern ran down the street, his face turned red. He stopped and put his hands on his knees. The protagonist looked up. In front of him was a coffee shop. Sunan adjusted his jacket and sighed. The guy went inside. The cafe was crowded. Looking ahead, the boy wondered if his girlfriend had arrived. The girl was sitting at the table, looking at her phone. Suddenly, she looked up, seeing her friend in front of her. The woman accused him of being late. The intern frowned in displeasure. She looked at him with a smirk. There was a mug and a plastic cup of cola on the table. The heroes sat opposite each other in silence. Looking up, the protagonist asked what they wanted to talk to him about. The girl took her phone in her hands. She handed it to her friend and asked him to look at something. Sunan picked up the phone from the table. A bead of sweat ran down his tense face. On the lock screen was a photo of his girlfriend with a man hugging her. He closed his eyes and thought that he had known about this for a long time. He handed the phone back and asked if this was all they needed to talk about. The woman took her phone back. Looking down, she said that the man was also a chef. She raised her eyebrows and said that her new fiancé was very different from him. The woman raised her hand and said that he had a completely different perspective. The woman picked up a mug and said that the man was a bit old but worked as a sous chef at a hotel that was in the top 20. The boy frowned angrily. His girlfriend called him a junior chef at a hotel that was barely in the top 100. She raised the mug to her mouth and said that she did not want to invest in a man like him. The intern raised his eyebrows and realized that he was just an investment. Putting the mug on the table, the girl said that was all and asked if her friend had anything to say. Closing his eyes, the protagonist answered negatively. Getting to his feet, the woman said that it was time for her to go. Approaching her ex, she asked him to thank her for opening his eyes to this world. The protagonist looked down. She headed for the exit of the cafe. There was an untouched drink on the table covered in condensation, emptied beer bottles lay on the floor, and an empty bag of chips lay nearby. Sihun was sleeping on the mattress. Suddenly, he woke up and opened his eyes wide, putting his hand to his head, which was hurting terribly. The guy decided to check what time it was. The time appeared on the screen. It was 6:30 in the morning. The young man realized that he was an hour and a half late. Grabbing his jeans, the intern realized that he needed to run to the store for food. Suddenly, he shuddered. A memory of them standing in the kitchen flashed through his mind with Jinnik telling him that he didn't need to go shopping because there was a cooking test. Closing his eyes and letting out a sigh of relief, the protagonist realized that he needed to work instead of going shopping. A smile appeared on his face. Putting his hands on his hips, Sunan decided to do his best. Clouds were floating above the jewelry hotel. The cooks were running around the kitchen. Someone was putting plates in the cupboard. The guy turned around. The head chef was standing in front of him. At that moment, the captain turned away. People with groceries ran into the kitchen. They thought that their colleague was having a hard time being in charge of shopping all this time. Hands on the table, the young man asked them to put the ingredients in the refrigerator. The cooks were standing in the kitchen. One of them yawned. Suddenly, someone opened the door. John Man, who was late, ran into the kitchen frowning. Sangha asked why he was late again. The line cook replied that he would change in 2 minutes. The trainee looked up. The other staff were discussing their colleague's tardiness, calling it another reason to yell at him. The man abruptly opened the door, tying his apron. The blond man said that he arrived at exactly 8. Sangha gritted his teeth in displeasure, mentally insulting him. Jinak brought his fist to his mouth and cleared his throat. John Man put on his chef's hat in fear. He hurried to take his place among the cooks. Standing in front of them, the head chef announced that the Food Safety Administration had decided to select the top 20 hotel kitchens. Crossing his arms, the captain added that they would select them through a competition program called Best Chef, which would be broadcast on KBC and in which anyone with sufficient experience could participate. Suna looked at his smiling colleague in surprise. The man explained that their hotel was not even in the top 50, so this was their chance to improve the hotel's reputation. The sous chef nudged his fellow kitchen chef, hearing that he would not be able to participate in the competition. The man's mouth dropped open in surprise. Pointing at himself, John Man declared that he met all the requirements. Jinnik frowned in displeasure. The line cook said that he had only been working for 6 years and was suitable for participating in the competition. Pointing at himself, the blond man promised not to let them down and to improve the hotel's reputation. The head chef averted his gaze and said that his subordinate was mistaken because they hadn't decided on a representative for the hotel yet. Jungman's eyes widened in shock as he asked who would be that representative. The captain averted his gaze. The protagonist flinched at being called. The man's brows furrowed sternly, as if reminded of the culinary test. In shock, the line chef looked at his colleague after Jinnik announced that they would have a test, the winner of which would be the hotel's representative. The chef was chopping onions with a tense face, and the blonde turned away to watch Sunghoon make soup. The man thought he was very lucky, so he cranked up his speed, hoping to pass the test. The head chef scowled and announced that the representative would be the winner of this cooking test. John Man pointed to his colleague and asked if it was clear that they shouldn't compete since he should be the one to take part. The guy scowled in response. The line chef argued that his colleague was inexperienced and unfit to compete against him. The captain closed his eyes and explained that the young man had no issue with the terms of participation and that they were on equal footing. He promised to make a decision after they finished the task. Standing in front of his subordinates, the man asked them to prepare breakfast for a group of Chinese tourists who arrived yesterday and stayed at the hotel. Their menu would be placed in the lobby. John Man frowned. The intern looked forward resolutely. The one whose menu sold the most would be the representative. Jinnik asked if there were any objections. The line cook smirked and answered negatively, pointing a finger at his assistant. The head chef asked what about him. The protagonist closed his eyes sternly, knitting his eyebrows. He answered negatively. The captain smiled, and the guy shuddered, frowning menacingly. The man said that for dinner those tourists had chicken, duck, and beer on the menu, and this should be taken into account. Light food should be made. The contestants had to make a light breakfast. There were bowls of chopped vegetables on the table. Throwing them into the pot, the blonde thought that he could handle it. Stirring the soup, John Man thought that for the past 2 years, he had only been assigned to make soup, which made him the most outstanding chef in this hotel. The line cook raised the ladle to his mouth to taste the soup. The soup was boiling in the pot. The blonde thought that it tasted very good and decided to make sandwiches as well. Looking at his competitor, the man wondered what he had been doing all this time. Peas were boiling in one pot, and rice soup was heating up in another. Holding a stack of bread, John Man asked what kind of baby food this was. The protagonist took the boiled peas out of the water and poured them into a bowl of cold water. Sunu opened the pod to get the peas. The peas fell into the bowl. The guy poured them into a bowl and added water. There was a small amount of sugar in the spoon. The young man turned on the mixer. The device began to rotate, turning the peas into a smoothie. The lid of the mixer opened. The intern poured the smoothie into a glass of ice. After looking at it, the chef decided to move on to the rice soup. Steam rose above the pan. The protagonist picked up a full plate of soup in his hands. After peppering the soup, Sunghoon decided to add some more salt and green onions. On the table, there was a glass of smoothie and a bowl of soup. Approaching the competitor, the line cook asked what that peculiar smell was and whether it matched the hotel. Closing his eyes, he asked to look at his menu on the table. There was cheese soup and a plate of sandwiches. Pointing at himself, the blond man declared that his menu would sell better than this poor man's food and thought that his colleague was wasting his chance that Jinnak had given him. Looking around, the man thought that the head chef had decided to help him out by making breakfast, the test menu. Putting his hand on his belt, Hunan asked what it looked like. The captain asked what he needed to look at. Looking at the rice soup and pea soup, the chef du party asked if there would be people in the hotel who would like it and if such a menu would kill anyone. Raising his eyebrows, the man realized that his colleague had never seen these dishes before and asked what he thought of them. There was ice in the pea smoothie. Hunan asked what kind of hotel would even offer this for breakfast since it was impossible to imagine even as a dessert. Jinnik said that he thought he had the experience of a man who had worked in the kitchen for 25 years. The chef du party opened his mouth in surprise and asked what that meant. There were dishes from 2 menus on the table. Next to them were stickers with letters and arrows. The head chef, crossing his arms over his chest, reminded them that the one whose menu collected more orders would be the hotel's representative in the competition. Chinese tourists entered the hotel cafe. They looked at the menu options in surprise. Hearing that, they ordered 1 menu and 4 of menu B. John Man clenched his fist in joy. People continued to order menu B. The lion cook constantly poured soup into the bowls and made sandwiches. He smiled, thinking that everything was happening as expected. The Chinese man leaned over the bowl of soup. No matter what country they were from, tourists would always choose soup and sandwiches. Looking at his competitor, the blonde man thought that he would never be able to win with a menu that was ordered only once. The people went to the menu. The man asked what they would like to eat. His friend said that he drank too much yesterday, so he should eat something light and healthy for the body. They stopped in front of the counter with 2 menus. The protagonist closed his eyes and wondered if his menu was too bold. Putting his hand on his shoulder, Sang-gun praised him and said that this menu did not suit their hotel. Looking down, Sang-hun agreed with him. Hearing that someone ordered 10 of menu B, the hero's mouth opened in shock. They looked ahead in surprise. Another 10 orders came in. The guy raised his eyebrows in confusion. Jinnik smirked and thought that the show had begun. Imagining drunk people entering the cafe, the head chef thought that now 80% of the guests were Chinese, who worked for Hansen Company and came on vacation. This was their first visit to Korea. There were 2 types of menus on the table. Most likely, the Chinese would choose the dishes that suited them best, not the ones that were hard to chew. The young man poured soup into a bowl. He prepared this menu with people in mind. There was a bowl of hot soup and soy milk on the tray. The Chinese happily ate their breakfast. Holding a smoothie in his hands, the man smiled. Sunu and Hun Man widened their eyes in shock when they heard that many people ordered menu B. Someone asked if there were any dishes left on the menu. The intern smiled and said that they would be ready soon. At this time, John Man frowned tensely. The lion cook thought that this was simply impossible. A drop of sweat slid down his cheek. The cook stood in the kitchen in front of their boss, holding a paper in his hands. Jinnik decided to announce the results. The protagonist was happy while his competitor looked uncertain. Gritting his teeth, the blonde man couldn't believe that his soup and sandwiches were losing to the rice porridge with peas. The head chef frowned and decided to read out the results. A hotel employee burst into the kitchen and interrupted him, saying that the CEO wanted to see him. The captain looked around and asked if it was really that urgent. There were people standing in the hotel lobby. The men shook hands. One of them got into the car, and they said goodbye. The CEO walked back into the hotel. Jinnik approached him and asked why he was called. The man put his hand on his shoulder, smiling widely. The CEO praised him for his excellent work. The hotel employee said that the company chairman, Hansen, was in a great mood thanks to today's breakfast. The head chef smiled. The man raised his eyebrows and explained that the Chinese had been to some Korean hotels before, but none of them served authentic Chinese cuisine, so the company chairman had booked a room in this hotel for 6,000 guests for 2 months. Jinnik looked down happily. Walking down the hotel corridor, he thought that his subordinate was a very good person, and his guess was correct. Hearing the vibration, the head chef looked in his pocket. The captain looked at the phone screen and saw that it was an unfamiliar number. The man put the phone to his ear, smiling. The director of the KBC show greeted him. Frowning, Jinnik said that it was an honor for him. Hyunwoo explained that he was calling about the program, Top Chef, and that there were several changes to their program. Raising his eyebrows in surprise, the head chef asked what the changes were. The producer said that they changed the rules, and now 2 people could participate in the show. The captain thoughtfully put his hand on his belt. Looking ahead, he clarified if they needed to send 2 chefs. The director explained that there would be both team and individual tasks, and for everything to go well, they needed to send 2 people at once. Smiling widely, Hyuna asked if they knew what they would lose if they did not participate in the show. The man frowned in displeasure. After some time, he stood in front of his subordinates. Jinnik crossed his arms and explained that he had to take a break and would announce the results shortly. Looking at his colleagues, the head chef explained that today's competition was their first since they started working there, and asked how they felt. With an angry frown, John Man said that his dishes were perfect and suggested that the guests did not choose his menu because they were simple country bumpkins who were not used to living in a hotel. Sang-gu clenched his teeth in anger. The sous chef grabbed his subordinate by the collar, waving him off. The lion cook asked if that was not the case and stated that the company's executives chose his menu, and the workers chose the competitor's menu. The protest looked down, clenching his fist. The man stated that the contestants still did not understand what he did wrong. Jinnik stepped between them and asked them to calm down, stating that this was not about who was worse but about who was better. The head chef asked his colleague to behave properly and not to grab others by the collar. Sangha looked down and apologized. Turning to his junior, the captain asked what he thought. Keeping a calm expression, Sanghoon said that Koreans always order ramen or kimchi when visiting other countries, so he wanted to cook a breakfast that Chinese guests might like. The guy added that it probably created a bad impression because of cooking such an informal meal and apologized. The man smiled, closing his eyes. Jinik said that if it was about the elegance of the hotel, then Jman's menu was the right choice, and if you think about the guests, then his menu was also good. The head chef added that the first participant did not even think about what the guests needed because he only cared about maintaining the standard. The line chef gritted his teeth in displeasure. The captain explained that his competitor's menu was great, but the Chinese don't like cold food, so putting ice cubes in soy milk was a bad idea. The intern raised his eyebrows in surprise. Closing his eyes, the man explained that the representative was originally supposed to be the one with more orders, but he had just received a call from the channel saying that each hotel could now send 2 representatives. The participants in the cooking test gaped in amazement. Smiling widely, Jinik said that they would now be on the same team and wished them to return with the best result for their hotel. The sun was shining on the resort hotel. The chefs had gathered in the hall. The film crew was nearby. The protagonist frowned tensely, thinking that there were too many people here. Sunan looked away. Jongman bowed, attracting the attention of the chefs from the other hotels. Crossing his arms over his chest, the guy thought that this was a good opportunity to become part of the program and asked what kind of tasks there would be. 2 people approached him. Ji noticed her ex with a surprised frown. Heyman was standing next to her. The young man looked at them, and the heroes looked at each other tensely, frowning. The intern realized that his friend was also participating in this program as a representative of the hotel. The sous chef, with his mouth open, asked what the assistant was doing here, who was still on probation. The girl asked him not to worry about it. The man said that he did not want to see him here. The main character turned away. The woman asked her fiancé not to embarrass her, and to talk to her off to the side. The man in the chef's hat waved his hand, smiling widely. Yunti was glad that his friend was here too. Shaking his friend's hand, the chef asked how he managed to participate in the show. Sunan replied that the rules suddenly changed and he was able to join. Raising his eyebrows, the man remembered that now 2 people from the hotel could participate in the show. He waved his hand and said that the competition was about to start, and decided to do everything in their power. Approaching his colleague, Jongman asked if it was the chef from the Hilton Hotel. The guy confirmed it. The lights were on in the room. Suddenly, the lamps went out. Looking up, the lion cook asked why they turned off the lights. The young man assumed that filming was about to begin. A spotlight came on under the ceiling. In the other corner of the room, exactly the same spotlight came on. The light fell on the large doors opening them. The man entered the room, and the intern's mouth fell open in surprise. Raising his hand, Munin thanked everyone for coming. It was the chef who worked at the Hayes restaurant in Manhattan, a 3-star Michelin hotel. The woman came out to the journalists, and was surprised that there were so many young guys here. Smiling, Yunin hoped that everyone would be healthy. She had 40 years of experience. The man put his hand on the wall, and said that it was getting hot in here. Jisung raised his eyebrows and greeted everyone, hoping that all the contestants would show their best skills. This man had 30 years of experience, and was the head chef of the Hilton Hotel. Jman's mouth dropped open in shock. The protagonist thought that this was the first Korean to win first place in a foreign hotel. The judge smiled, and said that by the end of the day, more than half of the contestants would go home. The man waved his hand and asked how anyone could come here with the intention of going home, and decided that everyone came here with the desire to be the best. The black TV screen sparkled. This was one of the prizes that the winner would receive. The other prize was a free interior design from an enterprise. The kitchen had all the necessary cooking equipment. Munin closed his eyes and said that there was something else waiting for them. Pointing to the screen, the man said that the winner would receive 100 million. Sihoon's mouth dropped open in surprise. He imagined money raining down on him from the sky. Raising his hand, the judge announced that the first task was behind him. People walked into another room. On the table were plates with various foods. Next to each plate was a number. Looking at them, the boy wondered what all of this was. Crossing his arms, Mung stated that buying ingredients is the basis for a chef. There are times when a chef buys the ingredients themselves, or buys them through suppliers, or leaves it to the juniors. Looking at the contestants, the man explained that even chefs with less than 10 years of experience can judge the level of a hotel just by looking at the ingredients used. The young man looked ahead silently. The first task is to guess the names of the ingredients. Pointing to the table, Jisung said that the contestants need to sit at the table and write down the names of 50 ingredients according to the number on the plate. The trainee frowned. The judge said that they could touch them, but they could not cut them or eat them, and they had 15 minutes to complete the task. On command, the protagonist walked forward, looking at the ingredients. The man asked what they were. His girlfriend said that she had never seen anything like that before. Sunghoon picked up the fruit. Looking at it, he thought it was strange. The man wrote down on the paper, frowning tensely. Jongman tried to understand. He was number 42 and was outraged that there were so many types of fish. Gritting his teeth, the lion cook thought that he was in charge of soups, so he knew all kinds of vegetables, but he knew nothing about fruits and fish, which he had never even touched. The man looked up, looking at his competitor. The blond man wondered if he really knew everything since he was writing so quickly. Looking at his paper, Jongman wondered if he should cheat a little. The cameraman approached them and started filming their tests. The lion cook thought there were too many cameras. He looked at the screen and realized he was running out of time. The guy brought his pen to the paper and stopped. The young man frowned. A drop of sweat ran down his cheek. The trainee thought he recognized most of the ingredients, but two products were unusual. The strange fruits were deliberately placed next to each other. Wiping his forehead, the protagonist remembered reading about these ingredients and that they were tropical fruits. The pen stopped at the paper. Sunghoon clenched his fist. Jason crossed his arms and shouted that time was up and asked the contestants to give them their work. Jahi closed her eyes. Heyman pursed his lips in displeasure. Yuni smiled. Jongman put his hands to his head in fear. The man handed the judges a paper, looking away. Yunnan asked if they were going to determine the ranking after combining the scores of the chefs from one hotel. The man smiled and confirmed it, putting his hands behind his back. Hyuna said that this and the next task would be done quickly, so they would do it in groups. Looking at him, the woman said that it was a great idea and asked if they had too many contestants. The show director asked her to take a rest while they checked the work. Waving his hand, Mung said that they would announce the results, which would be shown on the monitor, except for first place. Jongman frowned. His name was on the list. The paper said that he had 28 points out of 50. The lion cook clutched his head and realized that he was doomed because he was ranked 148th. The couple from the Pia Hotel stood behind him. Ji smiled. She had 41 points. Heyman smirked. He had 43 points. The blond man looked at them with displeasure, wondering why they were acting like lovers during a competition. The girl looked away. The main character was standing at the end of the room. He was looking at the list. The woman mentally asked him to stop looking for his name and expressed her confidence that he was in last place. She looked ahead. The boy's name was on the list of participants. Seeing his result, Ji's eyes widened in shock. He had 48 points out of 50. Jongman's mouth dropped open in amazement, not understanding how this was possible. The girl frowned in confusion, looking at her ex. The woman thought that she had started cooking much earlier than him, and wondered how he managed to get so many points. Sunghoon closed his eyes. The contestants were confused about who he was and what kind of hotel jewelry it was. Smiling, Noonan prepared to announce first place. Wai looked forward as he was announced as the first place winner. Raising her eyebrows, Yunan called the Hilton Hotel special for having an employee who managed to get 49 points. Jisung stated that it was just average and was upset that his student did not get the maximum points. Holding a gold coin in his hands, the judge announced that the winner of this task would not participate in the next round. The man pinned a badge to the chef's shirt. Under the badge was a name tag. Looking around, Mung asked what they should do with the rest of the contestants. Closing his eyes, the Hilton Hotel chef explained that the task was to evaluate them individually. The contestants gaped in shock when they heard that the judges would be adding up the scores of 2 contestants from each hotel, and those who scored less than 75 would be sent back. Jisun, with his mouth wide open, praised those who were eliminated for their efforts. The man folded the pile of papers together. Looking through the exam papers, the girl thought that there was a question that was difficult for her to answer. She picked up the main character's work. On the sheet, numbers were crossed out with the captions, Dragon Fruit, and Ramatam. Putting her hand to her chin, the girl thought that the correct answers were Longan and Sapadilla. Taking the phone in her hand, the stranger decided that this simply could not be true. The screen showed those same tropical fruits and their names. Looking at the paper again, the girl realized that this was the correct answer, but the contestant used high words, so his answers were marked incorrect. Sitting on the couch, the girl was glad that he managed to pass this test. Putting his hand on his chest, Jiman realized that he was able to move on only because of his colleague. The man frowned. looking at his competitor. The lion cook asked if he had cheated. The protagonist replied that he would not do such a thing. Leaning towards him, the blonde suggested that Yunti helped him pass the test. Hearing a negative answer, the cook suggested that they return to the resort hotel since they were finished. The sunset sky hung over the city. Night had fallen. Sunghoon was standing on the balcony. In his hands was a can of soda. Sitting behind him, Jong-man asked if they had broken up since the girl who looked like his girlfriend was with another man. The guy narrowed his eyes in displeasure. He took a sip from the can, frowning. The lion cook was indignant that the junior was ignoring him and drinking without even answering. Holding the can up in front of him, the blonde man said that the man holding hands with Ji seemed indecent to him. Taking a sip and remembering the couple, the man said that he knew the man well because they went to school together, and called him someone who seduces many girls. He assumed that she simply found a replacement for her ex, but this was a mistake. The young man was looking down from the balcony. The intern said that this was natural. Jong-man looked at him in surprise. Holding a can of soda, the protagonist said that dating her was his choice, but they broke up because she was tired of him. However, he had no grudges or hidden feelings. Remembering how the girl and her new fiancé stood behind him, Sunghoon thought that they had underestimated them throughout the competition. Then the man smirked and slightly knitted his eyebrows. The guy squeezed the aluminum can in his hand, frowning. He decided that he couldn't forgive them for this. The sun rose over the city. The lion cook was sleeping on the bed. The young man was sitting and reading a book. The intern squinted. He had a notebook with notes in his hands. The cook closed his eyes. 7 years ago, the sun's rays illuminated the hospital. Adjusting his glasses, the doctor said that he was very sorry to have to say this. Standing in front of the protagonist's family, the doctor explained that the cancer had spread to other organs, so recovery was impossible. Sunghoon frowned in disappointment. His mother began to cry. The girl covered her face with her hands. Dong-gak looked down, folding his hands with and four attached. The man with cancer asked how much time he had left. The doctor replied that he had 6 months. The man squinted. He looked up. The boy looked at his dying father. An airplane was flying in the sky. The boy was walking down the street with his father. The future cook wrote down everything he said about fruits in a notebook. They tasted the dish in a cafe. The protagonist picked up a bell pepper at the market. The sun went down. The heroes watched the sunset. They held hands. An incredibly beautiful orange sky hung above them. Dong-gak was lying on a hospital bed. His wife and daughter were crying, begging him not to die. With dry lips, the man called his son. He handed him a notebook with a trembling hand. Crying, Sunghoon took it. The father said that he had been collecting these recipes all his life and asked his son to use them wisely. Smiling, the cancer patient asked him to become a great chef. The family bent over the body of the deceased Dong-gak. The guy was holding a notebook in his hands. The young man tied an apron behind his back. There was a name tag hanging on his shirt. The intern looked at himself in the mirror. Jong-man continued to sleep, drooling. The lights in the hotel were turned off. Suddenly, a loud sound came from the speakers under the ceiling. Opening his eyes, the lion cook asked what happened. The voice said that the time of the new round had changed to 5:15 minutes. The protagonist furrowed his brows in determination. The voice asked everyone to go down to the first floor within 5 minutes. The blonde wiped his drool and asked why it was necessary to do this now. Sunghoon put on his chef's hat. Opening the door, he decided to go down first, and asked his partner to hurry up because there were only 5 minutes left. Minutes left. The man put on his rope. The judges were sitting at the table surrounded by cameramen. Yunin frowned. Jisung put his hands on the table. Suddenly, something made his mouth open in surprise. The guy came down from the second floor. The young man approached the judge's table. The man furrowed his brows sternly, handing the participant a number. The Hilton Hotel chef asked him to take it and sit on the left. Looking at the number, the trainee thought that it helped that he usually had to wake up very early to buy ingredients. Hearing someone's excited voice, the protagonist looked back. Approaching him, Jang-gi asked if his friend was going to displace him from the first place. Sunghoon replied that he simply could not sleep sitting on the sofa. The chef said that his friend worked hard, guessing the ingredients, and explained that it was an easy task for him because his hotel had most of these ingredients. The guy assumed that his old acquaintance was bragging because he was jealous. People walked down the stairs quickly. The girls were dressing in a hurry. The man with his mouth wide open asked them to stop. Crossing his arms, Msung declared that their uniforms must be worn properly because anyone who is not perfect will not be able to pass the test. Pointing at the mirror, The judge asked them to come back after they had adjusted their uniforms. Smiling, Yunin assumed that it was time. Jing looked at his wristwatch. The hands showed 15 minutes past 5. Standing up from the table, the judge declared that that was all for now. The chefs looked at him. Many of those who had not had time to prepare were barred from entering the room. Frowning sternly, the man explained that the number of those who would pass this surprise test was exactly 7. These 7 would be allowed to be the first to present their cuisine to the jury. The young man's mouth dropped open in surprise. Sunghoon felt awkward when they started talking about him. His friend smiled, congratulating him. Jason crossed his arms over his chest, saying that was all. Another chef took off his hat in disappointment, cursing. The man looked at him silently. He put his hand in his pocket and asked again. Suddenly, he pointed at the cameraman, calling him over. He looked at the screen, listening to the chef's words. Then Jen glared at the guy. Both chefs tensed up. A badge of one of them was visible. The man covered his eyes and addressed them. He immediately took away their badges, stunning them. Jisung threw the badges, saying that they were eliminated from the show. The badges fell to the floor. The chefs, dumbfounded, asked questions and apologized. To this, the man raised his foot, then stepped on the badges, breaking them. After this, the chefs were scared. Adjusting his tie, Jisung praised them. He left, leaving them in despair. The cameraman crossed his arms over his chest, deciding to save this scene. He smiled, wanting more incidents like this. It turned out that their ratings would skyrocket. The kitchen was shown. A crowd of chefs had gathered, and it was announced that they could cook here. The man in glasses held a sheet in his hand, talking about the time the dish would be presented. Sunghoon and his friend smiled. Suddenly, the young man tensed up, deciding to take the chance. After all, here he was, thinking. He closed his eyes and thought. The jury appeared. The cameraman looked at the sheet, talking to them. Suddenly, the woman noticed something. The man was happy with Sunghoon's results. Jisung was thoughtfully looking at the sheet. A photo of the young man was shown. The man frowned, thinking that he had seen his name somewhere. The cameraman was addressed through an earpiece, and everyone was getting ready for the scene. Jung sat with his arms crossed. When the start was announced, closed doors were shown. Here, Sunghoon came out with a dish. He stood in front of the jury. It seemed that the young man was calm because he was smiling. Jisung disinterestedly asked him to introduce himself. With his hands behind his back, he introduced himself. Another man smiled, asking for his dish. Immediately, the young man reached for the lid of the dish and opened it. It turned out there were 3 pieces of meat. Jisung was serious and asked the reason for choosing this dish. Sunghoon explained his decision with an awkward smile. The man then thought about it. Suddenly, the boy became serious, confirming that he was now the assistant chef. He was surprised by Jisung's next words. His face darkened, and many thoughts were spinning in his head. The man sat with his arms crossed while another judge examined the dish. The man in the gray suit smiled, noticing that the boy mentioned a book. Sunghoon frowned at this, thinking that his dish was getting cold. He then firmly declared to himself that he would make them try the food. The woman was surprised by his remark, asking if he learned anything. Suddenly, the boy confidently declared that he learned everything from the man. The judge raised an eyebrow, grinning. Jisung was amazed at this. The woman clutched her head in despair. The man tensely offered everyone to try the food. The boy's dish was shown. The judges gathered around him, holding chopsticks. Sunghoon watched tensely. Jisung made an emotionless comment on the food. He picked up a piece with his chopsticks. The man took a small bite. He chewed with his eyes closed. Suddenly, Jisung opened his eyes. The piece of meat approached the sauce. It was dipped. The man took a small bite. The woman chewed. Jisung did the same. Now his eyes widened. The boy sat down, taking out dessert. It turned out to be in 3 cups. The man willingly took one of. Here's the text with corrected punctuation. Then, Jisung drinks it gradually. Sunghoon watches tensely. The man smiles. Everyone sits contentedly. Jason crosses his arms, asking if this was his idea. Embarrassed, the boy says he saw it in a manual. He bows when he is allowed to go. Jason looks at him thoughtfully. The director smiles, telling the cameraman not to film. The participants, one by one, suddenly the man becomes furious. Curly raises an eyebrow. Jason crosses his arms and asks the woman for her opinion. She looks away, commenting on the situation. The man, however, is thoughtful and speculative. A piece of meat is revealed, and an analysis of the dish is made. Jisung raises his head, asking the director a question. He frowns, stating that he felt a rich flavor. Suddenly, the man looks down, thinking he remembers the piece of meat that was delicious. Jisung looks at his neighbor, who states that it is kiwi. Len Juri raises a finger, expressing his thought. Kiwis are revealed. The man smiles, expressing his surprise. Jisung silently lowers his head, closing his eyes. He looks away, claiming that he has changed his mind. Looking at the director, he states his idea. Curly hesitates. After that, the man only looks away, asking about the second task. Smiling, the man in the gray suit states that he has strange expectations, thanks to Saemin. The woman raises an eyebrow, agreeing. Jisun just looks away, deciding that this is how it should be. The director tenses up. The cook walks down the hallway. He thinks awkwardly. Here, the young man smiles, saying that he was excited. It shows what happened 2 hours ago. He puts his hand on the meat, closing his eyes. Suddenly, a field with cows is shown. Smiling, the young man decides that there is no problem with the meat. He notices mushrooms in the back. Then, Sunghoon approaches them, wondering whether to add them to the dish. Here, the young man closes his eyes, thinking. Pine branches appear. Opening one eye, he is perplexed. Suddenly, he starts sorting through the mushrooms, being sure that they are royal cherries. Sunghoon examines them. It turns out that one mushroom is different, and it is matsu. The young man picks it up, thinking. Suddenly, he frowns with determination, ready to use the mushroom for the dish. He starts cooking. Now, Sanin is already taking off his shoes. He takes off his cap, sighing. The young man opens his eyes when he is addressed. An angry guy stands in front of him, cursing. To this, Sunghoon calmly tells him that he cooked everything well. The cook purses his lips in displeasure. He tenses up. Suddenly, memories of Sunghoon from yesterday appear. The young man passes by, deciding to take a break. The cook looks down in confusion. It turns out that he has received a message. While Sunghoon is undressing, he is being called. Then he tenses up when he is told that they want to see him. He turns his head in surprise. The guy looks at his phone, having many questions. The young man frowns, believing that those who fail will be given a second chance. He puts his hand on the guy's shoulder, supporting him. To this, the cook smiles, agreeing. Sunan gives him a thumbs up, and he is embarrassed. Suddenly, his phone starts vibrating. He looks questioningly at his pocket, taking out his gadget. The young man thinks about postponing the second task. Then he sees a message about an interview. Sunan calmly answers. He puts the phone away, deciding to rest before the interview. The guy looks at him awkwardly. A building with lights on appears. Sihun goes down the stairs. He turns around, noticing a girl. It turns out that it is Mina, the scriptwriter who wrote to him. The young man bows, greeting her. They find themselves in a cafeteria. Sunan looks tense. He nervously looks away. Smiling, Mina asks if her interlocutor is nervous. To this, the young man awkwardly says that this is his first interview. The girl kindly asks if he worked in the hotel kitchen for 4 years. Looking away, the young man confirms this. At this point, Mina begins to be perplexed. She smirks, deciding to ask something more difficult while Sunghoon continues to be nervous. A question is asked about whether he felt offended. Smiling awkwardly, the young man shares his feelings. Suddenly, Mana is confused again. She holds a piece of paper in her hands, talking about the chef's dish. Here, the young man smiles, talking about it, listening attentively. The girl asks why he did not tell the judges about what he just said. Sihun looks away, saying that he just wanted them to try his dish. Mina smiles sweetly at him, and it turns out that he saved part of his explanation. Now, she professionally asks if the chef lied about the manna. Sunan is embarrassed, asking what she thinks. The girl only closes her eyes, realizing that her interlocutor does not know how to lie. Smiling, she asks the last question. The young man thoughtfully lowers his gaze. His hands are shaking. Then, smirking, he decisively declares that he will definitely be first. The girl is surprised by this. She straightens the sheets, ending the interview. The young men bow to each other. Sunan leaves, climbing the stairs. Watching him go, Mina asks the cameraman for his opinion. He looks away, noticing that this is just a termination. Looking at one point, the girl thinks that this is something else. She remembers the boy's face. At that moment, the cameraman feels awkward and confused. Mina smiles, believing that the boy has a reason for such statements. He holds on to the railing, moving away. At this point, Mina resolutely frowns, deciding to expose him. The cameraman turns his attention to her, looking questioningly. It turns out that she is simply talking to herself. There stands the boy. With his dish, he tries to calm down, closing his eyes. The waiting jury members appear. The woman adjusts her glasses, noticing that the chef is also from Georgia. Jason turns to the director, asking if this is the last participant. He calmly expresses a desire to finish with him quickly. After that, the director calls the chef through the earpiece. The doors swing open suddenly, and the woman is taken aback. The guy resolutely moves forward. The wheels of the tray are spinning vigorously. He stands in front of the judges, and the man laughs awkwardly. The chef confidently opens the lid, deciding to show them the dish. The food is already visible. It turns out to be barbecue pork ribs with grilled shrimp. Jason crosses his arms over his chest, examining the dish. Hyunwoo, trying to hide his disappointment, says that the dish was amazing, but in fact, he is sad that it was another meat-based dish. Jisung suddenly calls out to Hyunwoo after asking the man if the rest of the participants would see the score. Hyunwoo replies by saying that only 7 people who took the test were sent at the same time, so they would see them during the broadcast. Frowning, Jisung suggests not to be too strict in this case. Johnman, who served the barbecue, chuckles, introducing himself as a chef with 6 years of experience and in charge of soups. Jisung frowns, asking if he thought that being in charge of soups for 6 years was a long time. Youngman replies, saying that their seniors always surpassed him, which made it difficult to advance. Nanung smiles and asks him to tell them about his dish. The guy frowns and asks himself if he could tell them about it, much like Sunghoon. Having decided he could, he slightly surprises Munsung by telling him that his dish was made from a comic book series. Yoo-jun stands up, saying that they do not care about the story because the most important thing is the taste. Youngman grins, watching the judges move. They begin to put on gloves, after which Jisung takes one of the ribs in his hands and immediately bites off a piece. The taste of the meat surprises him a little. Nanung, unlike him, takes a shrimp and, in a second, separates the head of the shrimp, after which he bites into the flesh of the shrimp. But after trying it, Munsun becomes dissatisfied. At this time, Yunin is separating the ribs, and when she sees the internal state of the meat, the woman sighs tiredly. Johnman, seeing this, frowns, not understanding why no one is eating. When Jason is already wiping his mouth with a handkerchief, the guy suddenly shouts, saying that he has prepared an addition to the dish. The dissatisfied judge asks what it is. Smiling broadly, Johnman says that he has prepared a remake of a military song from a real person, and when he begins to sing, it shocks the judges. The guy, instead of singing normally, screams like a savage, which greatly angers Yoonjun. So she orders him to shut up. Without holding back her anger, the woman says that the guy is really annoying her. Jisung, deciding to interrupt his partner, calls out to Johnman, and a moment later, he frowns angrily, asking the guy what he is allowing himself to do. The guy is scared when the judge calls him an idiot who does not know the basics of cooking. Then he points to the dish, and asks the guy if he has tried his dish. Jisung then points at the member, saying that his dish is terrible, that he cooked it for so long as if he was playing with the food. Did he extract the blood from the back ribs? Johnman worriedly says that he didn't have time because it took 20 minutes just to boil the back ribs. The guy can't help but look at his dish when Jisung says that there would still be blood left, and if he had eyes, he better look and see something reddish in the ribs. Unhappy, Yeojun says that he also didn't get rid of the smell and just poured wine into the rice after boiling it. Yoon-sung frowns and says that he simply couldn't be a chef with 6 years of experience, and in general, if he had boiled it with spices like bay leaf, garlic, and pepper instead of SAU, the disgusting smell would have disappeared. Jongnan becomes nervous but doesn't say a word. Looking at the shrimp, Manson says that it is undercooked because it should have just been cooked with salt. Angrily, the judge tells the contestant that before thinking about adding fried shrimp to pork ribs, he should have thought about compatibility by removing them from the grill and adding oil. Youngman is horrified, looking at his dish. Jisung points at the guy and tells him to eat it all tonight, not to leave anything, and to realize his mistakes while eating this horror. The guy bows his head, saying that he will do so. Then he takes the cart and heads for the exit. Jisung frowns, saying that something is wrong with this hotel because a guy with 6 years of experience is much worse than someone with 4 years of experience. Manson agrees with him. Yunin angrily says that it would also be hard for the hotel to endure because the hard work of the head chef is no joke. Jing interrupts the woman, saying that not only the head chef's job is hard, but the person supervising him is probably hurt too. The man grits his teeth, realizing that he had expected too much from a 4-star hotel. At this time, Sang-hun is reading his book. He soon closes it, looking at the person who comes in. It turns out to be a disappointed young man. Prad asked how it went. The guy said nothing, barely containing his disappointment and sadness. Passing by the protagonist, the guy mentioned that he was thinking about home. Afterwards, he offered the protagonist something to eat, but he refused. Sunghoon, not noticing the sad expression on his face, told his partner to rest because tomorrow it would all start again. The events take us to the next day. The protagonist was adjusting his uniform when he looked back at John Man, asking him if he was okay. John Man looked at the protagonist and said that he could not sleep. Sunghoon surprised the guy by saying that there was an energy drink in the fridge that he could drink because, since the program was starting again, he needed to get ready. The protagonist soon found himself at the gate, which swung open. Inside, there were numerous kitchen appliances and devices, with the newest items displayed on the tables. The cooks were amazed by what they saw, comparing the hall to a banquet. Menson, who was standing nearby, greeted everyone. The man waved his hands and said that they would complete the second task here. The protagonist became serious upon hearing this. Menson extended his finger, saying that their task would be to cook man as a team. The judge sat at a distance, watching the participants, to whom Menson, smiling, announced the essence of the task. Hyuna came up and corrected the man's speech. Unaware of this, he pointed to the side, poking the participants to look there. The judge started touting their sponsor. Hyuna, who was standing by the side, was taken aback by the eloquence of the ad. Just then, Mung introduced Han Sung as the special guest director. Han Sung extended his hand to greet the contestants. Turning to the old man, he asked him to explain the rules of the challenge. The contestants tensed up when the old man informed them that they had 30 minutes to prepare a bowl of nan men and present it to the judges. They would be divided into 4 teams, with one team being eliminated. With a smile, Han Sung assured them that the type of nan men they served was irrelevant, but that there was one stipulation: their noodles had to be handmade. Sunghoon tensed up. The task demanded careful consideration because they had to decide which on one side were the refrigerators stocked with ingredients, while on the other was the entrance door, which they could easily use. As the judge raised his hand to signal the beginning, the protagonist considered his options and decided to focus on the noodles. Then, Chan Man approached, offering to make regular nan with buckwheat noodles, so he needed to make broth. The protagonist approached and asked what kind of nan they would make. The guy became angry and shouted at her, saying that there was no need to ask such irrelevant questions because if he said to make broth, it would be nan with water. Rather than argue, the protagonist simply agreed. As the protagonist opened the refrigerator, he made the decision to use mat gxa since they had used buckwheat flour for the noodles. Upon taking out the ingredient, he realized that the organizers had already decided they wouldn't have time to make donkey, because it was in the refrigerator. Now he just needed to choose the ingredients. Sunghoon reached out and grabbed the top-class brisket. The protagonist examined the meat, garlic, green onions, and then scowled, realizing he had never used this in a jaman. Meanwhile, Chanman was making the dough. An unconscious glance at the protagonist caused him to yell at him, telling him to make the broth quickly. With clenching his teeth, at this time, Sunghoon began to cut the meat. He frowned mentally, saying that since they didn't have much time left, he would cut the meat into smaller pieces for the broth. Once the meat was cooked, he could use it for the garnish, and the soup would be ready soon. He added the prepared ingredients to the pot. After that, he immediately added water and started to boil it. Looking at the nervous Jang Man, he realized that he would use all this time to cook the noodles, so he also needed to prepare the garnish. Soon, the guy prepared a small pot to boil the eggs in water with salt and vinegar. Then he took out the dichi, cut off the root, and decided to turn the radish into a good decoration for the dish. The protagonist looked at the pot and smiled. The water began to boil, so he could take out the eggs after 10 minutes, and when there were about 5 minutes left, he could start cooling the broth. But remembering the noodles, the guy frowned. He turned to the nervous Jang Man and asked if the noodles would be ready in time, who replied, telling him not to worry and to continue making the broth. But in reality, the dough was tearing so easily in his hand that making noodles was a dream come true. Suddenly appearing behind him, frowning, the protagonist asked Jang Man if he had used buckwheat flour for the dough. Jang Man, puzzled, asked if buckwheat noodles were made from buckwheat flour. Worried, the protagonist said that it was usually combined with starch, and if he used only flour, it would be difficult to make noodles from the dough without a machine because there was not enough gluten in the mixture. Tearing the dough, the angry chef asked if he should have started over. Pushing Jang Man aside, the protagonist said that he would fix it himself because they did not have time for noodles. The chef, surprised, asked what he should have done. Sang-hun looked at him and asked him to bring him a bag of ice and turn off the stove when the broth and eggs were cooked. Gritting his teeth in anger, the protagonist said that he would leave the rest for him. Chanman, slightly frightened, decided to obey, looking for starch among the flour. The protagonist cursed in his mind. He just took the starch, wary of Changman's ignorance. Soon, he took out potato starch, which he immediately poured into the dough. Putting on gloves, the protagonist was worried the noodles would be overcooked if he started right now. When Chanman brought ice, they only had 10 minutes left. When the protagonist began to roll out the dough, the time was reduced to 8 minutes, and only when there were 5 minutes left was the broth poured onto the noodles, which Sunghoon immediately began to move. 2 minutes before the end, he placed the pan in the ice, and at the last minute, they peeled the noodles. The protagonist gritted his teeth in anger. Noonan stretched out his hand, announcing the end of time. Soon, several types of Ningmen were placed in front of the judges, in front of which stood the team members Ji and Haiman. Seeing that their opponents were Sunghoon and Young Man, they were slightly happy. The protagonist himself, at this time, was carefully looking at his man. Jisung picked up his chopsticks, deciding to start the tasting. He looked at the participants and announced it. The first dishes were Ji and Haiman's. Frowning, the judge asked if they were from the Freya Hotel team. The couple looked down when Jisung told them that they had just the typical Haeming man taught in culinary school, using sweet potato starch for the noodles. The judges soon began to taste the dishes. Even Yunnan tried the noodles. Ji was nervous watching this, so was her partner. Wiping his mouth, Jing said that it was pretty ordinary. There was nothing special about the noodles and broth. The couple tensed up when the judges gave them 75 points. The next dish was bibimbap, which the judges soon tried, and they gave 80 points to the cooking team. When Jisung looked at the next dish, he was amazed. It was Ningnan using ma gaku. Looking at the boys, the judge asked if it was masu. The boys smiled, saying that it was. Youngman frowned and asked Sunghoon if mguku was considered ning. The protagonist whispered to him, saying that he was part of this family. Yoonjun looked at the noodles and expressed her admiration. Jisung smiled, saying that he thought the buckwheat flour itself was of the highest quality, but they cooked the noodles well. Noonan, without saying anything, simply tried the noodles, after which he grinned and said that this team did an excellent job. The boys bowed when the judges awarded them 90 points. Ji saw this and tensed up. They had the lowest score among the 3 teams. Frowning, she turned to Hyan, saying that if they were expelled, their relationship would be broken. Looking at the protagonist, Hyan told the girl not to worry because they would definitely be expelled. Jisung took the protagonist team's Pingyang man and said that it was made from the same noodles as the previous teams, then asked Youngman if they were from the jewelry hotel. Youngman worriedly confirmed this. Jisung picked up the bowl, deciding to start tasting. A moment later, the noodles fell into his mouth. Right after him, Yunnan also tried the noodles, and Yunnan decided to pick up the bowl and taste the broth. Sunan tensed up, expecting the worst. Unexpectedly, Jisung smiled. This surprised the protagonist. The man looked at the guys and asked who cooked the noodles. The protagonist thought mentally, recalling the cooking process, but before he could answer, Young Man raised his hand, saying that he was the one who made the noodles. A smile appeared on the guy's face. Jisun looked at him and thought his fingers grabbed his hand. A moment later, he screamed and began to scold Youngman. He was very scared when he heard the judges scream. The man angrily began to list the shortcomings of the noodles. Youngman became very nervous listening to the screams. A second later, he pointed at the protagonist, saying that he was the one who made the noodles while he was busy with the broth and side dish. The protagonist glared at his partner in anger. His pupils shrank from insane anger. Jisung pointed at the couple and asked if the noodles were actually made by Sunghoon. The protagonist himself closed his eyes, realizing that now he could not justify himself. His fists clenched. He now just needed to stand there and remain silent, as making excuses would now be detrimental to the entire situation. If this had not been filmed, the protagonist would have hit his partner long ago, the partner who was now smiling contentedly, and called out to Sunghoon. With a frown, bowing his head, the protagonist admitted that he was the one who cooked the noodles. The judge thought for a moment, realizing that such hotels were simply hopeless. And because of the guy's skills, he was still an apprentice chef. It had already seemed strange to him. Back then, when he said that he learned about cooking from Samana, the guy was good at making glee. Jisung stood up, saying that he didn't even need to bother solving the assessment for this. The man began to approach the couple, getting very angry. Then he grabbed their badges, thanking them for their participation. The protagonist gritted his teeth. He didn't want to be excluded because of such nonsense, but suddenly, they looked away. Even Ji and Hyan, who were celebrating their victory, stopped dancing. Mung stood up and said that everything was strange. The explanation of what he heard and the things he saw were very different. Iman became worried when the judge began to dispute his words. Afterward, the man described how he had previously observed the cook. He noticed contestant Sunghoon preparing broth and contestant young man kneading dough. He smiled and asked the person whether he was incorrect about something. Youngman lifted his hands uneasily, then pointed to the protagonist, stating that while he was doing his best, this guy climbed in and grabbed the dough, picking up noodles with chopsticks. Mung questioned the man if he was serious. Afterwards, he smiled and explained that when he chose the type of flour, he chose buckwheat flour without hesitation, thus his dough did not stay together and was easily torn. But his time was over, so Sunghoon disagreed with him and began correcting the D. Chanman froze in amazement as he heard the judge's comments. Manson smiled smugly and suggested they watch the recording to confirm. Chanman bowed his head as he remembered that the entire operation had been filmed on camera. He closed his eyes and began to consider what to say, but when he ran out of ideas, he groaned and asked for pardon. Then he bowed again and begged pardon, freezing in that position. Jason called out to the guy, irritated. Then he seized his badge in his hand and ripped it away violently, congratulating him for his participation while implying their defeat. The youngster bent his head again, refusing to object. Jason gazed at Sunghoon and shouted out to him. After calming down, he asked him what he thought about losing due to his partner's meanness. The protagonist grimaced and stated that he was disappointed. The judge asked the kid why he was disappointed. Unfortunately, the youngster stated that he was unable to demonstrate his level of preparedness, and thus missed out on the opportunity to realize his ambition. Jason looked at the boy and stated that, while yesterday's dish was great, that was it. When the judge started outlining his transgressions, the young man turned away instinctively. Jason pointed at the boys and complained about the poor quality of their accommodation. The man, hardly managing his rage, declared that Sunghoon and Youngman will be terminated because of their poor teamwork. But this time, Yunin stopped him, forcing the man to look at her. The woman asked him if they needed to count their points. Why was he making all the decisions himself? Jisung frowned and stated that there was no need to count anything. Picking up the bowl, Yunin stated that the noodles were not very nice, but the soup was excellent. Yun also took up the bowl, agreeing with her, and drank the broth again before putting it aside. Mung said the broth was simply delicious. Yunin asked Sunghoon if he used chicken and beef brisket in the broth. The protagonist responded honestly, stating that the chicken attracted his eye when he opened the refrigerator to select ingredients for the broth and side dish. So he used chicken and brisket to make a classic soup, and to mask the pungent odor, he added all of the pepper and bay leaves. Yunin smiled happily upon hearing his remarks, then tensed and simply stated that it was worth 5 points. Manung smiled, indicating his agreement. He then turned to Jisoo and asked if he still believed there was no reason to count the points. Jisung clenched his teeth in rage when he heard his inquiry. The man scowled at Manung, questioning why he dared to argue with him so boldly. After calming down, Jisung stated that his decision remained unchanged. Hearing this, Sunghoon grew depressed again. Jisung appeared in front of him again, announcing that he was removing him from the program. He then extended his hand and asked for his badge back. The guy closed his eyes, telling Jisung not to give up hope for their hotel because he was fairly sweet. His statements astonished the judge. Youngman was surprised when the protagonist tried to rationalize his conduct. Jisung, who was watching everything, frowned again. Extending his hand, he instructed the protagonist to cease being calm because there were still several teams behind him. Ignoring his words, the protagonist dug into his pocket and pulled out a ticket that surprised the judge. Sunghoon handed it over, explaining that it was a ticket granting him the right to make a mistake, which he acquired yesterday following an unexpected test. Jisung narrowed his eyes, focusing on the protagonist. Then he took the ticket in his hand and announced that participant Sunghoon was immune from expulsion. Soon, all of the teams had returned to their positions, leaving only Jongman standing. Jisung, glancing at him, instructed him to go to his room and pack his belongings. The person lowered his head, indicating his comprehension. The events take us to the bus stop at night, where Sunghoon bows and bids Jongman farewell. He responded by waving his hand. The protagonist grinned, mentally advising his friend to be more honest because if he didn't stop this practice, karma would catch up with him, just like it did today. At this point, Jongman examined his. He reviewed his profile and decided to make it private after what had happened. Gritting his teeth, he suddenly remembered how he had told all of the neighbors what was going to be on TV. The bus quickly took off. The events lead us to Jisung drinking wine. He raised his glass to savor it, then sighed pleasantly. He banged the table, scolding Mung, no longer able to contain his rage. Jisun stated that after frolicking everywhere with his foreign foolishness, Meng had decided to show himself, or rather his arrogance. The man unintentionally took the bottle of wine and poured it into his glass. Gritting his teeth, the man realized Munson could clip and rephrase his comments, using them against him. When he had already raised his glass, someone knocked on the door, and Meng told the man that he was the one who had come here. Jisung frowned, unable to grasp the cause for his visit, but he nonetheless approached the door and opened it for the guests before freezing and glaring at the man. The man appeared to be surrounded by hostility. The men stared at each other for a time after seeing Meng. After a while, Meng informed Jisung that he had come to tell him something. The man turned around and urged Meng to come inside. Soon, they found themselves in the center of the living room. Jisung closed his eyes and asked the visitor what was wrong. Meng frowned and questioned Jisung why he did it previously. His ratings today were weird. Jisung stared at him, bewildered. Nanung inquired, seriously, why he didn't offer any marks to the Joria Hotel's meals. Jisung looked at the other man and said that they were talking about the horrible noodles they had made. Nanung closed his eyes, then yelled, moaning about their handmade noodles, despite the fact that he had told them to make cooled noodles with fur, to reject those who were only concerned with the noodles and had forgotten about the broth, and to include the one who promised to help him. Jisun disregarded the shouting and gulped the wine before slamming his hand on the table. Standing up, he reminded Manson that they needed to take out the weeds first, or he would forget how humiliated he was 15 years ago in America. Pointing at his interlocutor, the man instructed him to consider how the gentleman presented his food to them. He had clearly lied to them about being the youngest in his group. Jisun, unable to contain his rage, claimed that they should never have given him a chance. Then he slumped into a chair and asked Manson to leave if he understood everything. Manson, on the other hand, refused to go, claiming that he had no understanding of the situation. And while Jisun poured himself some wine, the man stated that a chef could only be expelled for his cooking abilities, and that removing a chef because of his history is discriminatory. He almost shouted his final words. Jisung lowered his eyes when Manson questioned if he had given Genti a perfect score. Suddenly, the man scowled. The person seated in front of him became serious, reminding him that they were in Korea. Manson clenched his teeth as Jisung explained that Korea was unlike the America he had visited. Looking at his old friend, Jisung stated that it was in his nature to remain in Korea, and he may even influence politics with today's outcomes. The man became upset again and urged Manson to make a decent decision. Hearing him, he became even more cautious. He regained his composure and asked Jisung whether he would continue to support Juni till the finish. Jisung did not respond and gazed at his interlocutor. Manson slapped his hands on the table, stating that if he continued in this manner, he would back Sanghoon. His statements astounded his pal. Manson smiled and remarked that the guy was talented. He meticulously performed his duties and did his best to compensate for his partner's shortcomings. And, despite the fact that they were unable to finish their dish, he calmly accepted this, as well as his partner's blunders. Despite this, he possessed the confidence that Manson recognized. The man closed his eyes and stated that simply looking at it made him want to see him grow up. Unknowingly, he would support him. Jisung punched the table in rage, shivering all over and asking whether he understood what he had just spoken. Manson frowned and stated that he knew everything and would not leave the competition judging to his own discretion. The man shouted, reminding him that they had to name 50 elements in the first task, and that he was also the one who launched the surprise exam on the second day. His statements infuriated Jisung. Leaning against the table, Manson inquired if he considered this a fair competition. Frowning, the man told Jisung that if he wanted to change his attitude, he needed to quit supporting the Hilton Hotel. Jisung's face went purple from anger. Manson put his hand in his pocket and decided to leave. When he turned around to duck, Jisung began to shout after him. Stopping in front of the door, Manson expressed hope that he recognized his earnest intentions. Jisung clenched his teeth, filled with rage and fury, and resolved to exact retribution. The circumstances lead us to the filming gang. Mina handed Hyunu a paper, claiming it was relevant to the main program. The girl covered her eyes and explained that the writing was about the program's heroes. Hyunu considered it when Mina recommended having numerous persons as the major protagonists. A second later, he assured Mina that they would absolutely choose those with high commercial value, and that it would be fantastic to include personal life experiences. Hyunu stated, somewhat frowning, that this was a tactic utilized in programs of limited interest. The group leader closed his eyes and stated that the selection of the key characters was very essential. Mina smiled and offered Sun. Putting the paper on the table, the girl stated that the guy withheld something during the interview, so she dug a little more and discovered that his mother suffers from a rare ailment. Hyuna grinned and decided to include the individual on the list. He then turned to the other members of the group and asked if they had any suggestions. One of the guys raised his hand to suggest Junti. Hyuna stated that after reviewing the papers containing information on the man, he clearly bore the aura of a typical elite. Hyuna, looking at Mina, suggested that Sun and Janti get acquainted. One of the guys was the youngest chef from a hotel in challenging conditions, and the other was a chef from a first-class hotel. Hyuna commented, smiling, that their image suited them. Suddenly, Hu's phone rang. He took the phone in his hands and apologized to the group before staring at the text of the message. He rose up abruptly, stating that he had an urgent situation that required them to do all of the job alone. Nina smiled, not too disappointed by this. Hyuna said goodbye to everyone after he became serious. The girl thought about it, trying to figure out who he was going to see. If she had known they despised Jisung, she would have prevented Hyuna. The group's efforts continues. One of the guys smiled and chose to recap because they had planned the situation. Mina was looking at her phone at this point, recognizing that Sunghoon had been booked to go to the hospital. The girl trembled in response to the protagonist's message. He requested to reschedule the interview. The girl, slightly astonished, inquired as to the explanation. The girl was overjoyed when she learned that the guy needed to go to the hospital. She quickly wrote to the protagonist, explaining that she was about to take a day off. The protagonist sighed in relief, almost forgetting that he needed to go to the hospital. Looking at his phone, he noticed Mina requesting permission to record him in the hospital. The protagonist grew a little worried, so he asked the girl if he'd get paid for this. Mina was stunned by his question. The events transport us a few hours forward to the courtyard of the house, where the film crew was preparing. The protagonist, turned her head and stared intently at Sunghoon. The girl involuntarily considered how the guy requested cash. He met her gaze and approached her. Approaching, the protagonist stated that he wanted to discuss money. Mina grinned and stated that they would transmit the monies to him following today's broadcasts. The protagonist astonished the girl by asking if they might transfer them right now. He said this with a serious expression on his face. Mina was perplexed. She didn't understand why the guy was so preoccupied about the money. Staring at the guy, the girl realized how weird she felt every time they discussed money, as if the guy had changed. Mina turned around and requested the protagonist to wait. Soon, she presented an envelope containing money, which he seized and began counting. After that, he exhaled in relief and bowed to Mina, starting to thank her. When the operator indicated that it was entirely ready, they got into their automobiles and drove to the hospital. The protagonist sat in the car and glanced out the window while the operator, sitting in the rear seat, filmed him. Smiling, asked Sunghoon when his mother became ill. Thinking, the protagonist responded, stating that 3 years had passed, and the journey proceeded under the girl's continuous questioning. She soon asked the protagonist what his mother was suffering from, and he replied, looking at Mina, that she had complicated regional pain syndrome, a disorder that produces agony throughout the body for no apparent reason. The protagonist was upset, explaining that his mother was usually at home, but she had lately been hospitalized, so he was constantly visiting her. Na was slightly astonished to hear his remarks. After that, she grew sorrowful, realizing the guy's condition. Soon, the gang arrived at the hospital. When the protagonist entered the hospital, he called his sister, who was leading their mother in a wheelchair. The protagonist approached their mother and asked whether she was okay. Kook gazed at the camera and wondered why there were cameras here. Upon hearing the inquiry, the protagonist instantly explained the scenario. Mina became saddened when she saw how the protagonist's mother was. Her multiple injuries to her face and breast were obvious. She spotted the woman's shattered arm, and her legs were in bad shape. Mina felt sorry as she remembered the protagonist's comments. The cameraman asked the girl if they needed permission to film. Mina immediately met Shun's mother and asked if it was acceptable to record them with her son. She grinned and agreed. Menon reminded her brother about the payment for their mother's treatment. They soon arrived at the doctor's office, where he unwrapped the bandages from the woman's hand and began examining her. The protagonist and his sister witnessed everything with anguish. The cameraman lowered the camera and announced that they might conclude it here. The protagonist unexpectedly drove his mother to Mina and asked her to stand beside him as he paid for her treatment. After obtaining her consent, the protagonist walked away. Hook grinned as he asked the girl if Sunghoon had passed the preliminary test. Nina grinned and stated that the guy had. The protagonist's mother, Gred, stated that she still needed to go see her son, of whom she was proud. Hook was relieved and asked when she could watch the finals, to which Mina replied that it would be after the weekend, on the first day of the week. The protagonist and M were standing near the cash register when the cashier looked at the monitor and announced the amount of the treatment. Nin handed over the card, saying that they would pay with this, and the girl became a little nervous, telling her brother that she should at least pay for her mother's treatment. Sunin sadly stared at his sister, who turned out to be working part-time, but the cashier suddenly returned the card, saying that the payment. The protagonist smiled as he handed over the envelope to his sister, saying that even though it wasn't much, it should be enough for the first time. Sunin explained that the money was an advance payment he received for the interview, and Mina, who was standing to the side, understood why the guy wanted to. In the hotel, Heyman was carrying glasses of wine for himself and Ji. He approached her and handed her a glass of wine, but the girl did not accept it. After a while, they found themselves near the car, and the protagonist knelt down, telling his mother that he needed to leave. His mother smiled, asking him to do his best and not be nervous, and Sihun smiled, accepting his mother's request. The girl was enraged at the thought of the Persia Hotel's sous chef losing to the assistant C. She removed the guy's hand and said she didn't want to drink. Heyman smiled and asked if it was because of yesterday's incident, but she didn't respond, mentally saying that they only passed because of luck. They had the lowest result among the 3 teams, and if Sang-hun hadn't made a mistake, she would have been expelled. The events take us to the next morning on the set, where the film crew was preparing the venue for the tournament. The employee bowed in greeting to Hyuna. He walked past him, ending up next to Mina and sighing, sitting down on a chair. Mina looked at the guy, asking what happened to him. Smiling, she guessed out loud that it was because of yesterday's case. Hyuna couldn't help but remember his meeting with Jisun. Entering his room, Hyuna asked Jisun what he wanted from him at such a late hour. Jisun closed his eyes and said that he would be frank. Then he looked at Hyuna, demanding that he change the judges because he would not work with Muna. Hyuna was shocked, saying that they had already been filming for a couple of days and it was already too late. He could not kick out the other judges. Jung frowned upon hearing his words. Hyuna threw up his hands, saying that the government was watching this show. Jisung bit his lower lip, barely holding back his anger. The head of the film crew was tense, watching him. Then he slightly surprised Jisung by asking him if he remembered the program they had done together before. Jisung heard him and looked away, trying to hide his shame because the store he was advertising on the show was selling imported meat and deceiving their customers by telling them it was domestic. But during their show, it was revealed that their meat was from Korea, and they were later caught. Hyuna raised his hand, reminding them how hard he tried to cover up what happened in order to protect Jisung from the consequences. Taking bribes from that store, he had to beg the director for help, and even then, he barely managed to resolve the situation. Jisung frowned, looking at Hyuna. A moment later, he closed his eyes, saying that he understood everything. Hyuna, however, did not feel any better from his words, and now he was sitting tense on the set. Then he looked at the set and said that they were changing the show's editing technique. Hyuna was determined to exact retribution, so he directed that the sequences of Judge Jison's swearing be left uncut and just the vulgar language be censored. Mino was concerned, asking if they should do it because the communications committee would be upset. Hyuna frowned slightly, claiming that because they were backed by the government, the communications committee would do nothing. He grinned and decided to turn Jisung into a clown. Jisung served as a springboard to help them elevate their performance. Soon, the contestants and judges had gathered. Jisung stood up to meet the candidates. The contenders began to cheer because they had all advanced to the finals. Only Sang-hun and Janggi remained calm. Ji and Hyun were tense when Jisung mentioned that not everyone who came this far did so because of their abilities. Being serious this time, the man stated that some of them may be standing here because their colleagues performed well, and he was confident that there were those here who did not make it out simply because they were unable to stand out. Suddenly, the guy exclaimed, "Today will be different. The judges will test their knowledge of the fundamentals from the start." Jisung took a piece of paper and read the first job. After reading it, he scowled and informed the candidates that they had never had to kill a living creature with their own hands to cook something. The contestants were ecstatic when they heard his remarks. Suddenly, a truck drove into the yard, loaded with chicken cages. The protagonist frowned. The scent was simply terrible. The truck soon came to a stop in front of the judges. The chickens in the cages closely investigated the people. Their odor caused many to hold their noses. Yunin suddenly grabbed a chicken and raised it up, explaining that their first mission would be to catch and roast a live chicken. The fowl made a loud noise. The cooks sweated in dread, and many covered their noses with their hands. Yoonjun smiled broadly and announced that the first job in the finals would be to catch and roast a live chicken. There were numerous cages with birds in the truck. Manson extended his hand to the side and ordered that as soon as the assignment began, each participant walk to the truck and take a chicken. He turned aside as Jisung instructed the candidates to remember something. He crossed his arms and stated that the mission would start with properly catching the chicken. There were stoves and other cooking items on the tables, and Jisung stated that the candidates were welcome to utilize them. Jisun furrowed his brow and shouted loudly that the candidates will have 40 minutes to complete everything before beginning the last assignment. A man wearing white gloves rushed out to grasp the chicken, one hand securely gripping the bird and the other grabbing its legs. Yun-sun, the Burgess Hotel's second cook, grabbed the chicken in her hands and claimed it smelled dreadful. The bird's eyes were wide open. The girl was sweating and her lips were tightly squeezed together. She extended her shaking hands to the chicken, urging it not to move. Suddenly, the chicken flapped its wings and extended its sharp claws for the chef's fingers. The girl clamped one eye tight and screamed in terror as blood spilled from a new wound on her arm. Jisun approached her, and the girl told him that a fowl had scratched her. She showed the man her haircut. Jisun frowned carefully, pointing to the side and informing her that there was a hospital center behind the truck where she could get medical attention. The man crossed his arms and directed the cook to return to the hotel immediately. Then he collected her belongings and left. Jisun ordered that she hand over her badge, and the girl paled in dread. The man extended his hand forward, reminding her that the candidates needed to catch a chicken for this challenge. The girl removed the emblem from her garments, gazing down sadly, and placed it in Jisung's palm. Yeonjun scowled, perplexed as to why the candidates were struggling to do this assignment, to which Muning responded that in today's world, individuals don't collect chickens on their own. Jen crossed his arms and stated that the last time he caught a chicken was 10 years ago, so this would undoubtedly be a new experience for the young chefs. Yun furrowed her brow and said that there was nothing they could do in that circumstance. The man looked aside, thinking that he didn't hold back this time because of the mission Yunin assigned him. While the contestants attempted to catch the birds, Jisun considered how the goal of this challenge was to eliminate as many individuals as possible, making it ideal for his purposes. The man gripped the chicken's legs hard, gritting his teeth from the physical strain. Ji looked at Hyan and said that this was not a team effort. When Dad stated he'd be back in the kitchen with the birds soon, the girl looked to the chicken cages. She was drenched in sweat and held her hands in front of her. Ji's eyes widened in surprise as someone instructed her to grab the chicken's legs first. She turned to the youngster, who said the bird should be turned upside down. He grabbed the chicken by the legs, and the protagonist turned it over. Ji scowled, questioning whether Sunghoon was assisting her. The protagonist, who was standing sideways to the girl, responded that she was holding up the line and that he was showing her how to do it. She knows how to do it. Sunghoon turned around and said he didn't want to see Ji fall behind like she did, while the others around her made mistakes. The girl frowned, indignantly. The protagonist approached the table and roughly placed the chicken. Sunghoon sweated and assumed he could do it so quickly because he had just watched a few videos of others catching chickens, but the true challenge would be killing the bird. The protagonist closed his eyes and considered looking into the chicken's memories. Sunan placed his hands on the bird, and the chicken's eyes opened wide. The birds were walking around the hay-scattered area. When the chicken heard a loud noise, it stopped moving. A man wearing a blue shirt carried a white bird out of the enclosure. He placed his hand on the chicken's neck, and its beak opened. Sunghoon's eyes widened as he heard someone call him out loudly. Jisun crossed his arms and asked the protagonist whether he was tired, and he said no. The man furrowed his brow in confusion and inquired as to whether Sunghoon was meditating. The protagonist stared at him and said he was thinking about how to murder the chicken. Jisung, outraged, inquired whether Sunghoon knew how to kill the bird. The protagonist furrowed his brow, thinking that the man would continue to nitpick everything he did, just like the previous time he was overly strict. Sunan looked at Jisung and said he knew how to do it, but he was simply thinking about how to improve. Jisung furrowed his brow in wrath, believing the protagonist was bluffing, so he planned to humiliate and put him in his place by eliminating him. The man opened his mouth and murmured, "I understand." He crossed his arms and told Sunghoon to do everything in front of him right now. The protagonist's brow furrowed in agreement. Jen looked straight ahead and asked to do everything right now. The protagonist put his hands on the bird's body, and the man instructed Sunghoon to demonstrate how he murdered the chicken. The bird's beak was open, and the man's face was distorted with wrath. The protagonist looked at him and realized that Jisung was waiting for him to make a mistake. Sunan remembered the man hauling away the chicken and decided that he needed to keep his cool, take his time, and mimic what the man in the video did. The protagonist frowned and decided that he should first turn the bird's head and slit its throat. He apologized to the chicken in his mind. He grabbed the bird's legs and decided to hold the chicken so that the blood might fall out. Sunghoon looked at the pot and decided that if the water was already sufficiently hot, he should reduce the heat to medium. The protagonist changed the temperature on the stove. A droplet of sweat trickled down his cheek as he considered immersing the drained chicken in water. Sunghoon picked up a plate and decided to remove the bird from the water after 10 minutes so that it would not overcook, and then placed the chicken in a cutting dish. The protagonist grimaced and decided that he should carefully pluck all of the feathers and dispose of them. There was a chicken on the chopping board, and Sunghoon decided to cut the leg joint to remove the feet. The protagonist wiped the sweat from his brow and concluded that the last thing he needed to do was acquire the chicken. Sunghoon put on transparent gloves and brought the knife blade to the bird. The protagonist scowled and decided to cut the front of the chicken from the top of the breast to the base of the tail, then remove the tail. Sunghoon inserted his hands into the bird to extract the innards. His face sweated as he worried that the gallbladder may explode, so he had to be cautious. Small feathers flew over the chicken's body. The protagonist grinned slightly, pleased that he had done it. He poured water from the bottle to rinse the bird and clean off the remnants after extracting the innards. Sunghoon gripped the chicken's body with his hands. The ideal chicken carcass was on the cutting board. The protagonist closed his eyes and sighed with relief. He turned to Jisung and said he was finished, which surprised the man. Sunghoon furrowed his brow and inquired whether he needed to explain how he did it step by step. Jisung frowned his brow in surprise. His face was sweating, and he thought he was attentively monitoring the protagonist to catch any errors, but he was so focused on watching that he didn't realize Sunghoon had finished. The man saw a chicken on the cutting board and thought it looked great. Yunan remarked, smiling, that she wanted to see it. The woman approached the table and looked at the chicken. There were gloves in the bowl, and Yunan claimed that the protagonist completed it the fastest of all the members. Jisung pursed his lips indignantly as the woman claimed they had to let Sunghoon go because he did an excellent job. Nung closed his eyes and agreed with a smile. He furrowed his brow and inquired whether Jisung agreed that the protagonist was a good butcher. The man gritted his teeth furiously and said sure. Sunghoon tightened his fists as Mung said loudly that he had completed the duty of cutting up the chicken and should wait on the second floor. Ji glanced around, her face furrowed in surprise. Yuni thought with a smirk, which was to be anticipated from Sunghoon. Han's mouth dropped open in disbelief. He clenched his teeth and watched the protagonist go away. Hyan closed one eye, convinced that it didn't matter. He smirked, thinking he'd just emulate the man in front. Sun furrowed her brow as she peered down, noticing a large signboard on the building. Sun first managed a restaurant that served samatang, and while it wasn't tough to run, she lacked ambition and excitement. The woman stared at the monitor. When she approached 40, she discovered a new dream, becoming a hotel chef. Sun listened intently to the man. Ordinary folks did not have the opportunity to push themselves, but she was fortunate. The woman was holding a frying pan. The hotel's head chef congratulated her and offered to train her. Sun was standing by the stove. She continued to work for the head chef, and at 48, this was her 5th year as a chef. The woman was picking the feathers from a fowl. She was lucky enough to participate in the show. Top chef. Sun frowned. This time, she was fortunate since they were assigned to carve up meat. The young man with glasses raised his hand, indicating that he was also finished, and the woman opened her mouth in terror. She looked at her chicken and felt bad when she fell behind because cooking fowl was her specialty. Sun grimaced at Heyman, knowing he had certainly duplicated everything she did. The woman pulled on her gloves hastily so that the man wouldn't see anything else. Hn furrowed his forehead in surprise. He sweated profusely, not understanding why Sun was now doing everything so fast. There was a bare chicken on the cutting board. Gritted his teeth, believing this was insane. The woman took off the bird's legs and used a knife to cut the chicken's breast. The man clenched his teeth, thinking Sun was traveling too quickly for him to keep up. The woman furrowed her brow as she looked back. Heyman lifted his hand and smirked, asking Sun to slow down so they could complete this duty together. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Heyman's mouth dropped open in horror as the woman addressed the judges. She lifted her hand, indicating that she was finished. Jisung furrowed his brow. Sun raised her hand, indicating that she had completed the work. Heyman's mouth dropped wide in surprise. He gritted his teeth tightly in wrath, and the man slammed his fist into the table. The woman turned around and screamed in fright. Jisung furrowed his brow and said loudly, "Who just slammed the table?" Man scratched the back of his head and mentioned that there was a bug on the table. He gritted his teeth furiously, convinced that Sun was trying to set him up. He furrowed his brow and reasoned that he had witnessed everything the woman did save the last portion, so even if he couldn't copy her, he could observe the others. The judges were watching the contestants. Jisun furrowed his brow and said that time had expired and that the contenders who were still working should halt and wait. The man crossed his arms and stated that the judges would now start judging their work. Ji furrowed her brow. She was the last to be assessed by the judges. The man stretched his hand forward. He was the 7th person to pass the evaluation. Sun folded her arms and passed the 3rd. Uni smiled and placed his hands on his waist. He was the 2nd. Sunan was the first to pass the judge's evaluation, wiping sweat from his brow, and pushed her mother in a wheelchair. The girl smiled and stated that the hotel was wonderful and that the second portion of the finale will take place there. The main character's mother smiled and stated that Sunghoon was doing well on the show. Menon scowled as the woman explained that she could now die without regrets. They continued down the hallway, and the main character's mother mentioned that Ji was also competing in the tournament. The woman smiled and explained that Ji was Sunghoon's girlfriend who frequently visited their home. She looked straight ahead and mentioned that Ji worked as a chef in another hotel. Nin's jaw dropped open, astonished. Ji strode along the corridor, arms crossed. Menon called her, and the girl frowned. The blonde's jaw dropped open in dread. Menon and the protagonist's mother moved closer to Ji. The woman asked, smiling, if Ji was competing alongside Sunghoon. The blonde sweated in anticipation, thinking that the protagonist hadn't told his mother about their separation. Someone suddenly placed their hand on Ji's shoulder. Heyman furrowed his brow and questioned why the protagonist's mother was acting as if she knew Ji. Jen opened her mouth in disbelief. Ji looked down as the girl inquired about Han's relationship with her. The protagonist's mother furrowed her eyebrows in surprise when the man exclaimed that he was not Ji's close buddy. He scrunched his brow and screamed, "We're dating!" Ji threw Han's hand off her shoulder and told him to stop yelling. The man's jaw flew open in surprise as the girl yelled that Sunghoon's mother was unwell and that he shouldn't be cruel to her. Ji looked away, and Heyman knew it was the protagonist's family. When Hyan wondered if Sunghoon had asked them to speak with Ji instead of him, the protagonist's sister and mother gasped in surprise. Menon furrowed her brow and exclaimed loudly that they were not present. For Ji, but not for the protagonist, Hyam exclaimed angrily that they should hunt for Sunghoon and stop acting like they knew his girlfriend. The protagonist, who was holding the headgear in his hand, gazed forward with surprise. Heyman placed his hands on his waist, demanding at Sehun's mother not to approach Ji again. The woman paled and began to sweat with terror. The protagonist's eyes widened in surprise as he dashed for his mother, shoving man away. He sat next to her and asked Minan what was wrong. Sunan asked his sister to call an ambulance because they needed to hurry and get their mother to the hospital. Minan dashed onward, and everyone gazed after her. Each frowned, announcing that the protagonist had arrived after all. Sohan stood motionless. The man glanced at the protagonist with displeasure, who explained that his sick mother would have convulsions when she was worried. The protagonist had his back to Hyan and said that he couldn't just yell at her. Ji looked down and apologized, saying she would pretend she did not know the woman. Hyan turned to the girl and explained that it was not her fault. He turned around and frowned fiercely. The man placed his hands on his waist and continued that if Sunghoon had stated that he and Ji had split up, this would not have occurred. Without turning around, the protagonist responded that his mother had just gotten out of the hospital, and he hadn't had a chance to inform her. Ji frowned when Sunghoon mentioned that they had only broken up a few days before, and he couldn't find the perfect time. Heyman lifted his hand and told the protagonist to stop harassing Ji. When Sunghoon explained that he still didn't understand him, the man's eyes widened in surprise. Holding the cap in his hand, the protagonist stated that he was no longer interested in Ji or anything associated to her. Ji furrowed her brow and turned away when Sunghoon suggested that Hyan should ask her personally if he didn't believe her. He furrowed his brow, realizing that it was his responsibility. The man stared at the protagonist, who suggested that they tackle their relationship's problems themselves. Sunan tightened his fist and turned around, facing straight ahead. The protagonist stated that he would not simply stand there and be silent if Hyan dared to do this again. Mina was casually walking up the stairs at this point. She turned toward the corridor after hearing the protagonist describe what happened to Hyan. She unintentionally looked out to check if the participants were squabbling. She noticed 3 individuals there. Hyman was furious, and the protagonist informed him that if he dared to do it again, what he did to his family today, he would not stand by and be silent. After that, the protagonist turned to H-Min and gritted his teeth, calling him an idiot. Sunghoon, on the other hand, ignored this and said farewell, but his enraged interlocutor refused to end the argument and continued yelling at him. When Mina saw this, she became a little nervous. She gazed at the protagonist's back, reflecting on what had happened. Soon after entering the room, the protagonist called his sister. When she picked up the phone, the guy excitedly inquired about her mother's condition, at which point he froze, listening to his sister say that everything was not well with her mother, but the doctor assured her that she did not need to worry because she would receive a prescription for an injection. The protagonist breathed a sigh of relief after hearing her comments. Then Sunghoon glanced at the bulb, as his sister questioned him about his ex and requested clarification. The protagonist closed his eyes and asked his sister not to discuss this further. Smiling slightly, he asked Minnan to hand over the phone to her mother, but his sister surprised him by abruptly shutting it off, stating everything was okay with her mother. Looking at his phone, the protagonist grew concerned. After calming down, the protagonist decided not to worry because his sister was next to his mother, and it was preferable for him to focus on the next assignment. He then got out his recipe book and sat on the sofa, beginning to read it. The judges soon addressed the test-passing participants through the speaker. When the protagonist learned that he had been summoned to the first-floor lobby, he raised his head. He closed the recipe book and decided to go. When he arrived, numerous people were already there. Sunghoon started looking about, hoping to discover the judges, but they were not present. However, upon spotting Shanta, the guy smiled and called out to him. He also grinned when he saw his pal and stated that he had given it his all. He then made the protagonist nervous by asking if he thought they were meant to meet in the finals. Sunghoon responded by expressing that he hoped they could manage the following challenge. Suddenly, the guy was amazed and remembered something, so he asked his pal if anyone else from their hotel was participating. Yoonhee, puzzled, responded that there was another one, but he was terminated after today's task. Raising his hand, the protagonist stated that given that the person had never cut up a chicken, it was logical that he was eliminated, regardless of how great he was at cooking. Yoonhee grew concerned when his friend asked him how he knew how to carve a chicken. Bowing his head, the man began to recall the past. He remembered his instructor, and how he learned to carve up a chicken under his supervision. Yoonhee closed his eyes and understood that telling Jisung learning how to carve up a chicken the night before the mission was announced would be foolish, so he looked at Sunghoon again and lied, claiming that he learned how to do so in the army while undergoing a special program. When his companion inquired where he learned how to carve up chicken, the protagonist smiled. Scratching his head, he said that he'd done it a couple times in the army when he was assigned as an assistant cook. Young Haeon was anxious, thinking that he had learned everything from the chicken's memories, but even if he told them, they would not believe him. Suddenly, they noticed the judges approaching. NTI offered his hand to his friend, encouraging him to give his all. Sunghoon agreed and extended his hand, after which they shook hands. One of the judges spoke up, attracting attention to himself while standing near the entrance. The man grinned and announced that the test will take place here. Following his instructions, the participants hurried into the hall. However, Sunghoon observed someone in the crowd. He frowned when he spotted two chefs he recognized. They turned out to be Subak and Ilu. Ilu chuckled as he noticed the protagonist, then stopped and stared at him, laughing. The two men commented that it was strange that such a dismal person was around. The protagonist could barely contain his rage. These folks were from the Mongan Hotel. He closed his eyes, deciding to ignore the men and concentrate on his duties. The cooks soon formed a line and rose in front of the judges. Neoman was startled to see that only 24 out of 200 participants remained. He frowned slightly, understanding he needed to be stricter given the tiny number of participants. Extending his fingers, he reminded the competitors that this was a paired task. 2 contestants would independently cook dishes of their choice and deliver them to the judges, who would then determine who to eliminate. Jinik, who was standing close to Sung, tightened up when she realized the contestants may kick their opponent. Suddenly, the chef summoned Sunghoon, who had completed the stage before everyone else. The man smiled and asked him to step forward. The protagonist complied and stood before the judges. Looking at the individual, Muning urged him to choose his opponent. The protagonist scowled, pondering about his opponent, and when the man opened his mouth to choose an opponent, Junti screamed, interrupting him. The man lifted his hand and stepped forward. The protagonist was surprised to see him. Nunung looked at him and inquired what type of inquiry he had. Stepping forward, Jangi inquired whether he could compete with Sunghoon. Nunung smiled and asked if there was any particular reason he wanted to do so. The guy grinned and stated that he wanted to renew their competition from 8 years ago. The protagonist grinned as he remembered an 8-year-old culinary competition in which Gongdi won first place and the protagonist finished second. However, the current scenario was diametrically opposed to that of the past, which is why Jangi was so determined to win. Sun turned to his friend, Jae, who was now looking carefully at Jangi. He was biting his lips, chastising Jangi for his decision. The man grimaced. If Jianji could win now, He could modify every program in the future to ensure his victory. Yunnan smiled and told Janti that he was overconfident about facing an opponent who had won first place. He simply smirked and shouted, claiming that it didn't matter. Jis, who was beginning to feel nervous, peered at the woman next to him. She looked at Sunghoon and inquired what he planned to do. The protagonist thought competing against Janggi was difficult. Even if he was considering another cooking competition, the man hesitated when Manson called. The man became serious and told the guy that he didn't have to engage in provocation because he could choose anyone. The protagonist used a serious tone and spoke the opponent's name clearly. Soon, the man found himself in the dressing room with Hyman. Hyman frowned and questioned why he was so sure in himself when he was only an apprentice chef. The protagonist said that he simply wanted to know how good a person working in one of the top 20 hotels was. Hyman could scarcely hold his rage as he looked at the protagonist and questioned if he was from Jula, a rubbish motel that ranked 100th in the country. When the protagonist heard his statements, he grimaced and turned to face him, saying that he was too arrogant to be a member of such a hotel. Hyman grinned and revealed that he knew the guy's genuine motivation. He merely wanted to exact revenge on the person who had taken his girlfriend. However, the protagonist did not glance at Hyman, claiming that he had previously discussed this with him in the hall. His statements astonished the person much. Sunghoon turned to the sous chef, stating he only wanted to see how he was. Hyman couldn't control his rage and wanted to scream, but the photographer summoned them, and they were obliged to stand before the judges. The boys were able to relax and did not show their actual emotions. The other attendees observed them from the sidelines, with some turning their focus to the table. Gianti frowned, not understanding the significance of the black cloth. Everyone looked to Jisoo, who announced that the object hidden in front of him will serve as the competition's theme. Frowning, he said that it was one of the themes. Looking at the guys, he inquired if they could determine what ingredients were hiding there. Sunghoon and Hyun both stated that they understood which substances were present. Jisoo snatched the cloth and threw it to the side. The theme of the tournament was eggs. Jisoo pointed to them and explained that these were the eggs from the hens they had murdered earlier. He then approached the judges, explaining that they needed to create a memorable dish using these components as the key elements. Yunnan grinned and stated they could focus on the eggs, the chicken, or both. The choice was theirs. They completed their dish within the time limit. Nanung smiled and stated that once the tournament began, they would set up walls around the cooking area so that no one could see what they were producing. Hyman and the protagonist grew serious. Jisoo immediately exclaimed, signaling the start of the competition. The protagonist walked straight to the refrigerator and examined the ingredients. He stood in front of it, trying to decide what food to create. Gritting his teeth, Sunghoon resolved to create a dish that the judges would never forget. Following that, he promptly picked up an egg. At this point, Hyun had gathered all of the ingredients and placed them on the table. He grabbed the onion and milk, thinking about Sunghoon while peeling it. The guy decided to demonstrate his skills as a sous chef by rapidly chopping the onion and placing it in a bowl. Feeling a great loathing for the protagonist, the guy determined to cook a dish that would throw Sunghoon out and force him to depart quickly. He found himself in front of the stove. He looked back, carrying olive oil in his palm. Hyman took a careful look at Sunghoon. He wasn't sure what dish he was going to prepare, but he assumed the person would utilize eggs as the major ingredient.